Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime Historian. Hey guys, tonight we're drifting back to a time when life was full of uncertain voyages across the ocean and the hope of starting fresh in a distant land that few in England truly understood. Imagine setting sail in late 1606 with roughly 100 men aboard 3 small ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery crossing the Atlantic in search of opportunity under the charter of the Virginia Company. These were not all seasoned explorers or farmers. Many were gentlemen unused to hard labour, along with soldiers, craftsmen and labourers drawn by promises of gold and a better life. The ships reached the Chesapeake Bay in April 1607, after months at sea marked by storms, shortages and disagreements among the leaders. They explored the coast before choosing a low, marshy peninsula on the James River for their settlement, naming it Jamestown after King James I. On the 14th of May, 1607, they began unloading supplies and marking out the first crude structures. The location offered deep water for ships but came with challenges: brackish river water, mosquitoes, and proximity to the powerful Powhatan Confederacy, led by Chief Powhatan, whose people had lived in the region for generations and controlled much of the surrounding land and resources. In those first weeks, the men cleared trees, dug a well, and started building a simple fort. Relations with nearby Powhatan villagers were mixed from the start. Some trading occurred corn and fish in exchange for English copper, beads and tools, but suspicion ran both ways. The English often demanded more food than the locals could easily spare, especially during a period of regional drought that had already strained native crops. Disease soon took a toll too, with contaminated water and unfamiliar conditions causing fevers and dysentery that weakened many settlers by summer's end. Yet the little colony held on, its triangular wooden fort slowly taking shape as a basic defence against both wild animals and potential attacks. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening right now, why not drop a comment with your location and the local time? It's always nice to know where everyone is tuning in from, as we ease into tonight's journey together. Now, settle in, and let's begin. The early days passed with the steady rhythm of survival tasks. Men felled timber for palisades, planted small plots of English wheat and barley that struggled in the unfamiliar soil, and learned to fish the river when weather allowed. Leadership shifted often in those months, with the appointed council including figures like Christopher Newport and John Ratcliffe trying to maintain order amid complaints about work assignments. Many of the gentlemen expected servants to handle the labour while they sought quick riches, but supplies from the ships dwindled faster than anticipated. By the time Newport sailed back to England in June 1607 with 2 of the vessels, leaving the Discovery behind, the remaining group numbered fewer than 100 and faced their first real test of endurance. Winter approached with limited stores. Hunting parties ventured out but returned with modest game, while fishing provided some relief when the river yielded sturgeon and other catches. Inside the fort, basic shelters of wattle and daub or simple framed huts offered thin protection against the cold. The Powhatan continued occasional visits, sometimes bringing food, yet tensions simmered as English foraging parties pushed farther into native territories. Chief Powhatan, ruling from his main village farther inland, observed these newcomers with caution, balancing trade against the risk of permanent intrusion on his people's lands. As 1,607 turned to 1,608, more ships arrived from England, carrying fresh supplies and additional settlers, though never quite enough to make the colony self-sufficient. Captain John Smith emerged as a practical voice during this period. A seasoned soldier with experience fighting in Europe and elsewhere, he had joined the voyage despite earlier conflicts aboard ship. Smith pushed for stricter discipline, insisting that those who did not contribute to building or gathering food should not share equally in the stores. He led explorations up the James River and its tributaries, mapping the landscape and establishing firmer trade contacts with Powhatan villages. On one such journey he was captured, and according to his own later account, the the chief's young daughter Pocahontas intervened in a ceremony that spared his life, though the exact details remain part of the complex relations between the two groups. Under Smith's growing influence, the fort expanded. A church was completed, storehouses reinforced, and fields cleared for more crops. He enforced a simple rule that labour was required for sustenance, which helped stretch limited resources through the second winter. Trade with the Powhatan brought corn, beans and squash foods the English gradually learned to incorporate alongside their own provisions. Yet underlying problems persisted. The swampy ground bred illness, and not all settlers adapted well to the manual work needed for long-term survival. By late 1608, Smith had assumed a leading role as president of the council, using both negotiation and firmness to keep the colony intact. The pattern of arrivals and departures continued into 1609. Another fleet departed England that spring, intended to bring hundreds more colonists and substantial supplies under a new charter that restructured governance. But misfortune struck at sea. A major storm scattered the ships, and the flagship Sea Venture, carrying the designated new governor Sir Thomas Gates along with key leaders and much of the provisions, wrecked on the reefs of Bermuda. The other vessels reached Jamestown in August 1609, with around 400 new arrivals, swelling the population to roughly 500. Many of these newcomers were unprepared additional gentlemen, artisans, and families expecting a more established settlement than the modest fort they found. With Smith recovering from a serious gunpowder burn suffered earlier that year, leadership passed to others, including George Percy. The sudden influx strained the already thin food stocks. The Powhatan, facing their own pressures from drought and the growing English presence, grew less willing to trade large quantities of corn. Skirmishes increased as English parties seeking provisions clashed with native warriors. By autumn, the fort held far more mouths than its stores or surrounding land could support through the coming cold months. Hunting and fishing became riskier as Powhatan forces restricted movement outside the palisades. What had been a difficult but manageable situation now tipped toward crisis as winter set in. Inside the triangular enclosure, daily routines shifted from building and planting to simple preservation of strength. Rations shrank to small portions of barley or whatever could be scavenged. Men, women, and the few children present huddled in the huts as temperatures dropped. The river water turned brackish and foul with the tides, worsening sickness. Stories later recorded by Percy and others described the growing desperation. First, the colony's livestock, horses, dogs, cats were consumed, then rats and mice trapped within the fort, followed by leather from boots, belts, and even the starch used for collars. Some ventured into the woods for roots or snakes when they dared, but many who left did not return. The social makeup of the colony reflected the classes common in early 17th century England. Though adapted to frontier conditions, gentlemen and their servants formed one group. The former often arrived with finer woolen doublets, breeches, stockings and hats suited for milder climates, while labourers wore coarser linen shirts, jerkins of canvas or leather, and simple breeches that quickly wore out in the damp environment. Food before the worst shortages included salted beef or pork from ship stores, bread or porridge from grain, and whatever fresh fish or game supplemented it. Native corn became a staple when available, ground into meal. Women, fewer in number at this stage, managed cooking, mending, and some gardening. Children helped with small tasks but faced the same hardships. As supplies failed, these distinctions blurred. Everyone shared the same gnawing hunger regardless of prior status. Through the long winter of 1609 into 1610, the death rate climbed steadily. Bodies weakened by malnutrition succumbed to dysentery, fevers, and exposure. Percy later wrote of the sharp prick of hunger that no one could fully describe without experiencing it. Men who had once argued over leadership now focused solely on finding the next scrap of sustenance. The fort's palisades, once a symbol of security, now felt like the walls of a trap as the Powhatan maintained pressure from beyond, preventing easy foraging. Archaeological evidence from the site later confirmed the consumption of horses, dogs, and even less palatable items, painting a clear picture of a community pushed to its limits. By early spring 1610, the population inside the fort had dropped dramatically. Of the roughly 500 present the previous autumn, only about 60 remained alive, gaunt figures who moved slowly and spoke little. The survivors presented a stark sight to anyone arriving fresh from England. Hollow cheeks, ragged clothing hanging loose on emaciated frames, and eyes marked by exhaustion. The ground within the fort showed signs of hasty burials, and the structures themselves had fallen into disrepair as maintenance gave way to mere survival. No new crops had been planted successfully the prior season, and the river offered little relief amid the ongoing restrictions on movement. This was the depth of what became known as the Starving Time. The combination of overpopulation from the late arriving ships, the loss of experienced leadership after Smith's departure, failed resupply due to the Bermuda wreck, and the strategic isolation enforced by the Powhatan had brought the colony to the brink. Yet even in these conditions, small acts of endurance continued sharing the last bits of found food, tending to the sick as best one could, and holding on to the faint hope that help might still come from across the sea. The English Crown and the Virginia Company had invested too much to let the effort vanish entirely, though no one inside the fort could be certain of rescue, as March gave way to April and then May, building the fort. The men stepped ashore on that low peninsula in the spring of 1607, and immediately set to work with axes and spades. Trees came down one by one, their trunks dragged into position to form the first lines of defence. The ground was soft and uneven, so they dug shallow trenches and raised a simple earthen bank before driving sharpened stakes into place. By the end of the first month, a rough triangle of wooden walls stood, with gates facing the river and the landward sides. Inside they cleared space for a storehouse, a small church, and rows of basic shelters. No grand plan guided them. Necessity dictated every cut of timber and every nail driven from the ship's stores. Captain Christopher Newport supervised the unloading while the council members assigned tasks. Some men felled more trees for clapboard roofs, others mixed clay and straw for wattle walls that could be daubed against the wind. The river provided fresh water at first, though it soon turned brackish with the tides. A well was sunk near the centre of the enclosure, but its yield proved limited and often muddy. Gardens were scratched into the soil beyond the walls when the weather allowed, though the seeds brought from England, wheat, barley, peas, grew unevenly in the sandy loam. Fishing lines and nets went out each morning, pulling in whatever the James River offered: catfish, perch, and the occasional sturgeon when the season favoured it. Nearby Powhatan villages watched these activities closely. Small groups of native men came to observe, sometimes trading small baskets of corn or fresh fish for English copper discs and glass beads. The exchange was cautious on both sides. The Powhatan already grew corn, beans and squash in fields cleared by fire and hand tools, rotating their planting sites every few years. They lived in longhouses covered with woven mats or bark, wore deerskin garments softened by hand, and moved through the woods with quiet efficiency. Their diet relied heavily on the three sisters' corn, beans and squash, supplemented by hunted deer, turkey and fish from the rivers and bay. English clothing of wool and linen looked heavy and impractical to them in the Virginia heat, while the settlers marvelled at how lightly the Powhatan dressed and how swiftly they could travel by canoe. Inside the fort, the daily rhythm settled into a pattern of labour and short rests. Gentlemen who had expected servants to handle everything soon learned they must swing an axe themselves if they wanted shelter before nightfall. Labourers and soldiers worked longer hours, their linen shirts stained with sweat and sap. Meals consisted of ship's biscuit softened in water, a little salted meat, and whatever fresh catch could be added. As summer advanced, mosquitoes rose from the marshes and fevers spread through the crowded huts. More than half the original group fell ill by August, their strength drained by dysentery and the unfamiliar climate. Burials began outside the walls, simple graves marked only by wooden crosses that soon weathered grey. Newport sailed for England in June with 2 of the ships, leaving behind a reduced company and the smallest vessel, the Discovery. Those who remained turned their attention to strengthening the palisades and storing what little grain they had harvested. John Smith, still recovering from the voyage's earlier disputes, took charge of several exploring parties that paddled upriver in the shallop. They visited Powhatan settlements, noted the layout of fields and longhouses, and returned with additional corn when trade succeeded. These trips revealed the extent of the chief's influence. Powhatan ruled dozens of villages stretching from the James River to the Fall Line, collecting tribute in corn and deerskins from subject groups. His warriors carried bows, arrows tipped with stone or bone, and wooden clubs, moving through the forest, with knowledge the English could only begin to acquire. By autumn, the fort had grown more solid. A larger storehouse stood near the river gate, its timbers lashed and roofed with thatch. The church, little more than a framed room with a rough altar, hosted simple services when the council required. Men repaired tools, mended clothing, and tried to preserve meat by smoking it over slow fires. The Powhatan continued to visit, but the quantities of food they offered decreased as their own stores tightened after a dry growing season. English demands for more corn met with polite but firm refusals in some villages. Small raiding parties occasionally slipped out from the fort to dig up native fields at night, an act that deepened mistrust on both sides. Winter arrived with cold rains rather than heavy snow. The river froze along the edges, making fishing harder. Inside the walls, fires burned in the huts to ward off dampness, but wood smoke filled the air and eyes watered from lack of proper chimneys. Rations shrank to 1 small meal a day for many. Those who stayed healthy continued the endless round of chopping firewood, patching roofs, and guarding the gates in shifts. By early 1608, the colony had lost nearly half its number to sickness and hardship, yet the triangular fort still stood, its walls a thin line between the settlers and the surrounding woods. New ships reached the river in January 1608, bringing fresh supplies and about 100 more men. The arrivals found the survivors thinner and more hardened than the optimistic company that had left England the year before. Unloading began at once, with barrels of meal, tools, and livestock rolled up the bank. The new settlers included more craftsmen, carpenters, blacksmiths, and brickmakers, whose skills helped improve the buildings. A second church went up, larger than the first, and additional houses extended the rows inside the palisade. Smith, now more firmly in command after council elections, organised work details and punished idleness with reduced shares of food. He also led mapping expeditions that charted the Chesapeake Bay and its tributaries, producing rough charts that later guided further voyages. Relations with the Powhatan grew more structured during this period. Smith negotiated directly with Chief Powhatan at his main village, exchanging English goods for substantial loads of corn. Pocahontas, the chief's young daughter, appeared at some of these meetings, carrying messages and sometimes food. The English learned a few Algonquian words and began to understand the seasonal cycle of native planting and hunting. Powhatan warriors demonstrated their skill with bows, sending arrows deep into wooden targets, while English muskets impressed with their noise and range, though powder and shot remained precious. Through the spring and summer of 1608, the fort expanded again. A glass house was attempted outside the walls to test local sands for making glass, though it produced little. Fields were enlarged, and a small herd of swine rooted in cleared ground. Fishing continued to provide a steady supplement, with men standing in shallow water or rowing out in the shallop. Clothing wore thin, woolen stockings frayed, linen shirts developed holes, and many settlers adopted pieces of deerskin traded from the Powhatan to patch their garments. Food improved slightly with the new supplies, allowing small feasts when a sturgeon was caught or a deer brought down. Yet everyone understood that self-sufficiency still lay far in the future. As 1608 drew to a close, the triangular fort had become a more permanent-looking settlement. Its walls enclosed workshops, storehouses, and living quarters arranged along muddy lanes. Guards walked the parapets at night, watching for fires or movement in the trees. The river flowed past the landing stage where the Discovery and later vessels tied up, bringing news from England and taking back small cargoes of clapboard and sassafras root. The Powhatan maintained their villages at a careful distance, trading when it suited them but never fully trusting the growing English presence. Inside the fort, the rhythm of labour continued, chopping, digging, building, mending each day, adding another layer of resilience to the fragile foothold on the James River. The work never stopped. Even when illness returned or tempers flared, men learned to sharpen their own tools, weave simple baskets, and repair the palisade after storms. Women, though few, managed cooking fires and tended the sick with whatever herbs could be gathered. Children carried water and gathered kindling, their small hands quickly calloused. The fort stood as a practical response to an unfamiliar world, not a grand outpost of empire, but a cluster of wooden buildings and determined people doing what was necessary to see another sunrise. First winter and leadership changest. The first full winter tested every plank and every person inside the triangular enclosure. Cold rains soaked the thatch roofs, and wind found every gap in the wattle walls. Fires burned low to conserve wood, so men wrapped themselves in whatever blankets or spare cloaks remained from the ships. Rations had already grown thin by December 1607. Each settler received a small measure of barley meal boiled into a thin gruel, sometimes mixed with a bit of smoked fish when the river allowed. Hunting parties went out when the weather cleared, but game had grown scarce near the fort, and the men returned with little more than squirrels or a single turkey. Sickness spread quickly in the damp quarters. Fevers gripped one after another, leaving bodies weak and minds clouded. The surgeon did what he could with the limited medicines brought from England, but most care fell to the sufferers themselves and the few women present. Burials became a grim weekly task. Shallow graves outside the walls received the dead, and the living marked each loss with quiet words before returning to their duties. By February 1608, the company that had numbered more than 100 in the autumn stood at barely 40 men, still able to work. Newport returned in January 1608 with the first supply, bringing food, tools, and about 100 fresh settlers. The ships anchored in the river, and barrels were rolled ashore under grey skies. The newcomers stepped onto the muddy bank and saw for the first time the reality of the settlement. Patched roofs, thin faces, and the constant sound of coughing from inside the fort. Extra hands helped unload, and for a short time the stores seemed almost adequate. Livestock pigs and a few goats were turned loose to forage, and the carpenters set about repairing the worst leaks in the buildings. Leadership shifted several times that winter. The original council had lost members to death and disagreement. John Ratcliffe held the presidency for a period, but his decisions often favoured the gentlemen over the labourers, which created resentment. Arguments broke out over work assignments and the division of the new supplies. Smith, still recovering from a stingray wound suffered during an earlier exploration, spoke plainly against waste and idleness. He argued that every able man must contribute or forfeit his share of food. His words carried weight because he had already proven himself on the river journeys, returning with corn and knowledge of the surrounding country. By early spring, the council elected Smith to a more prominent role. He organised work gangs to clear additional land and strengthen the palisade where winter storms had loosened stakes. Under his direction, the men dug a deeper well and built a larger storehouse with a raised floor to keep grain away from damp earth. Newport sailed back to England again in April, taking letters and a small cargo of clapboard. The colony settled into a steadier routine, with Smith's firm hand guiding daily tasks. He set clear rules. Those who worked received full rations, those who refused received less. The change reduced complaints and stretched the remaining supplies further. Explorations continued when the weather warmed. Smith led small parties up the Chickahominy River, trading for corn and mapping the waterways. On one journey he was captured by Powhatan warriors and taken before Chief Powhatan at Warr. After a period of questioning and ceremony, he was released and returned to the fort with more corn. The event strengthened his reputation among the settlers and gave the English a clearer view of Powhatan authority. The chief controlled a network of villages that stretched across the coastal plain, each paying tribute in food and goods. His people planted fields in the spring, harvested in late summer, and stored surplus in raised granaries. Inside Jamestown, the pace of building picked up. New houses went up along the lanes, their frames joined with wooden pegs and roofs covered with split oak shingles. A blockhouse was added at one corner of the fort for better defence. Gardens expanded beyond the walls, though deer and other animals often raided the young plants. The settlers learned to plant native corn between the rows of English peas, a practice picked up from watching Powhatan fields. Fishing remained important. Men stood in the shallows with nets or rowed the shallop out into deeper water when the tide favoured them. Summer brought its own difficulties. Mosquitoes rose thick from the marshes, and the river water turned foul again. More fevers appeared, though the death rate stayed lower than the previous winter, because the stores from the supply ships had not yet run out. Smith continued to enforce labour rules and punished theft of food with public whippings. He also trained some of the men in the use of muskets and pikes so the fort could mount a proper guard. Relations with nearby Powhatan villages remained cautious but functional. Occasional trading parties arrived with baskets of beans and squash, receiving hatchets and copper in return. By autumn 1608, the fort looked more settled. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and the palisade stood straight and strong. The church had been enlarged, and services held more regularly. Smith was formally chosen president of the council in September. He used his authority to send out disciplined foraging parties and to negotiate larger corn deliveries before the winter set in. The Powhatan provided generous amounts that year, perhaps hoping the English would remain dependent rather than expand. Inside the fort, the settlers dried and stored the corn in the new raised storehouse, mixing it with the last of the English grain. The second winter arrived milder than the first. Rain fell often, but deep freezes were rare. Food stores held because of Smith's careful management and the late autumn trade. Men repaired tools, mended clothing, and kept watch in shifts without the same level of desperation. Sickness still claimed lives, but the numbers were fewer. The new settlers from the supply ships had begun to adapt, learning which tasks suited their skills and how to move quietly in the woods. Children, though few, helped gather firewood and carry water, their presence reminding everyone that the colony might one day grow beyond mere survival. Leadership changes continued in small ways. When Smith suffered a gunpowder burn to his leg in the autumn of 1609, while returning from a trading voyage, the council moved quickly to replace him. George Percy, a gentleman with military experience, took over day-to-day decisions. Percy lacked Smith's forceful style and allowed some relaxation of the strict labour rules. At the same time, news arrived that a large new fleet was preparing to leave England under a revised charter. The Virginia Company had reorganised governance, appointing Sir Thomas Gates as Lieutenant Governor and Lord De La Warr as overall Governor. These changes were meant to bring stronger direction from London, but for the moment the fort remained under Percy's quieter hand. The autumn of 1609 saw the arrival of the scattered ships from the Third Supply. The Sea Venture had wrecked on Bermuda, but 7 other vessels reached the James River in August carrying roughly 400 new colonists. The fort suddenly held more than 500 people. Extra hands helped expand the palisade and build additional shelters, but the sudden growth also consumed stores at a rapid rate. Percy and the council tried to organise the newcomers into work details, yet many of the recent arrivals were unaccustomed to frontier labour and expected the colony to provide for them immediately. As leaves turned and nights grew longer, the Powhatan reduced their trading visits. Chief Powhatan had watched the English numbers swell and decided the time had come to limit aid. his warriors began to shadow English foraging parties, making it dangerous to venture far from the walls. Corn that had once arrived in baskets now appeared in smaller quantities or not at all. Inside the fort, the leaders rationed what remained, but with so many extra mouths, the portions grew smaller week by week. The stage was quietly set for the hardships that would follow. The first winter had taught hard lessons about preparation and discipline. Leadership shifts had shown how quickly authority could pass from one man to another when death or injury struck. The arrival of new settlers had brought both fresh labour and fresh strain. By the time the cold rains of late 1609 began in earnest, the triangular fort stood stronger than ever, yet its people faced a test greater than any they had known before. The river flowed past the landing stage as it always had, but the faces looking out from the palisade carried a new seriousness. Winter was coming, and this time the stores would not be enough. John Smith's rule captain John Smith assumed the presidency of the council in the fall and immediately brought a practical system of order to the entire settlement. He divided the able-bodied men into organised teams, each with a clear daily assignment that matched their skills and strength. Carpenters repaired roofs and strengthened gates, while soldiers stood regular watches along the palisade. Labourers cleared more ground for planting and carried fresh water from the new well. Smith kept simple tallies of each man's contribution and made certain that rations came only after the day's work was finished. Those who refused tasks received smaller portions, and the rule applied equally to gentlemen and common labourers alike. The change ended much of the earlier grumbling and ensured that stores lasted longer through the colder months. Smith also turned his attention outward to secure additional food through steady trade. He led small, well-armed parties to Powhatan villages along the James River and its branches, carrying English hatchets, copper pieces, and strings of glass beads. At each stop he sat down with the local werowance and followed the customs of greeting and gift exchange that the Powhatan expected. In return, the villagers filled baskets with shelled corn, dried beans, and smoked fish, sometimes adding venison or turkey when the hunt had been good. Smith arranged for these loads to be carried back to the fort by canoe or overland, where they were measured and stored in the raised granary to keep out rodents and damp. One such journey brought enough corn to feed the company for several extra weeks, and the pattern repeated whenever the weather allowed safe travel. These exchanges built a working relationship that kept the fort supplied without constant fighting. To understand the land better and plan for the colony's needs, Smith spent weeks exploring and recording the surrounding country. He took the shallop and a few trusted companions up the Chesapeake Bay, noting the mouths of rivers, the depth of channels, and the locations of native towns. On foot he walked the trails between villages, marking the fall line where the river became rocky and unnavigable by boat. He drew rough maps on paper brought from the ships, using a compass for directions and simple sketches of landmarks such as prominent hills or bends in the water. These charts showed the extent of Powhatan territory and identified places where future settlers might find good soil or safe harbours. When the maps were later sent back to England, they gave the Virginia Company its first clear picture of the region's layout and resources. Under Smith's direction, the fort's routine became more predictable. Each morning the teams formed up after a simple breakfast of corn porridge, then moved to their assigned places. Guards changed every 4 hours so no one grew too weary. In the evenings, Smith gathered the council to review the day's progress and plan the next trades or repairs. He insisted on keeping weapons clean and powder dry, and he trained some of the men to handle the larger cannon at the river gate. The discipline did not come from harsh words alone. Smith worked alongside the others when needed, showing by example how an axe or spade should be used. The settlers gradually saw that the stores held steadier and that fewer arguments broke out over food shares. Trade journeys gave Smith a closer view of Powhatan life. He observed how their villages were arranged around central longhouses and how fields were planted in small hills of earth to grow the 3 main crops together. Warriors carried bows and clubs, but also showed skill with the English tools they received in trade. Smith noted the way messages travelled quickly between villages by runners, and how Chief Powhatan kept control through a network of family ties and tribute. During one visit, the chief's daughter Pocahontas appeared with a group of women bringing extra corn, and the exchange proceeded with the usual formalities of speech and gesture. These contacts helped both sides gauge each other's intentions, while the corn flowed steadily into the fort. Mapping expeditions added practical knowledge that went beyond simple survival. Smith recorded the tides along the James River and the places where oysters and clams could be gathered at low water. He noted stands of timber suitable for shipbuilding and patches of ground that drained well after rain. On longer trips, he pushed northward toward the Potomac River, returning with descriptions of wider waters and different native groups who traded furs and shells. Each map page was labelled with distances and bearings so that future captains could navigate without getting lost in the maze of creeks and marshes. The information proved useful when new supply ships arrived, allowing them to anchor safely and unload without delay. The President's rules also extended to the maintenance of the buildings and tools. He ordered the construction of better chimneys in the huts so smoke no longer filled every room. He had the storehouse floor raised higher on posts to protect the grain from flooding during spring rains. Blacksmiths repaired broken hoes and axes, and the work was logged so that every repaired item could be traced to a specific team. Smith made it clear that tools belonged to the common stock and could not be taken for personal use without permission. This careful accounting meant that equipment lasted longer, and fewer hours were lost to broken handles or dull blades. Even with the added labour, Smith found time to write brief notes about the country and its people. He described the soil, the climate, and the ways the Powhatan prepared their food and built their canoes. These observations were not for idle reading. They were meant to help the company understand what kind of settlers would thrive here and what supplies would be needed in future shipments. The men in the fort knew that Smith's writings would travel back to England with the next ship, carrying the story of their daily efforts and the practical knowledge gained from trade and exploration. As the weeks passed, the fort took on a steadier appearance. The palisade stood firm, the lanes between houses were kept clear of debris, and the gardens showed rows of young plants protected by fences woven from saplings. Fishing continued each day, with the catch cleaned and smoked under Smith's supervision so that none went to waste. The President rotated the teams so that no group grew resentful of the hardest tasks, and he listened to complaints only after the day's work was done. This balance kept morale from slipping even when the river fog made the mornings damp and cold. Trade with the Powhatan remained the backbone of the colony's food supply. Smith made sure that every bargaining session included a fair count of goods on both sides, and he returned any damaged items to avoid disputes. The Powhatan appreciated the reliability of English metal goods, which held an edge longer than their stone tools. In turn, the English learned which seasons brought the best corn and which villages were most willing to deal. These patterns allowed the fort to plan its needs ahead and avoid sudden shortages. Smith's personal presence at many of the meetings helped keep the peace, since the Powhatan leaders had come to recognize him as the one Englishman who spoke plainly and kept his promises. The mapping work extended the colony's reach in another way. Smith's charts allowed small parties to venture farther for firewood or clay without fear of losing their way. They showed safe routes around shallow bars in the river and marked the locations of freshwater springs inland. When a supply ship anchored in the bay, the pilot could consult the maps to choose the best landing spot. The knowledge gathered during these expeditions gave the settlers confidence that the land held more possibilities than the small triangle of the fort suggested. Smith encouraged the men to study the charts themselves so that more of them could lead future parties. By the time spring arrived, the effects of Smith's rule were visible in the fuller storehouse and the improved condition of the buildings. The men moved with purpose, knowing that their labour directly affected what they would eat the next day. Trade continued at a steady pace, and the maps grew more detailed with each new journey. The President maintained his system of teams and tallies without easing the standards, even when new faces arrived from occasional small boats. The fort had become a place where order and effort turned uncertain supplies into a reliable, if modest, daily existence. Smith's approach rested on the simple idea that survival depended on shared work and honest exchange. He did not ask for more than the land and the Powhatan could reasonably provide, yet he insisted that nothing be wasted inside the walls. The combination of firm rules at home and careful dealings abroad kept the colony intact through seasons that had previously brought hardship. The maps and the corn stores stood as quiet proof that disciplined leadership and practical knowledge could make a foothold in the new country more secure. Smith's departure and growing tensions late in the year. While Smith was returning from one more trading trip up the river, a spark from a slow match landed in an open bag of gunpowder stored in the shallop. The blast caught him full across the leg and side, burning deep into the flesh and leaving him in immediate agony. The men brought him back to the fort as quickly as the tide allowed, and the surgeon cleaned the wounds and applied what salves remained in the medicine chest. Smith lay in his quarters for days, feverish and unable to walk without help, yet he still gave orders from his bed about the next day's work assignments and the careful rationing of the latest corn delivery. The injury refused to heal cleanly in the damp air, and the pain kept him from leading any further expeditions or standing watch himself. Word spread quickly through the fort that the president could not continue in his usual role. The council met and decided that Smith should return to England on the next available ship to have the burns treated properly by physicians there. In October, he was carried aboard one of the vessels that had come earlier in the season, his leg bandaged and his face drawn with discomfort. The ship weighed anchor and sailed down the James River toward the Chesapeake Bay and the open ocean. As the sails filled and the fort slipped from view behind the trees, Smith left behind the system of teams and tallies that had kept the colony functioning. The men watched the ship disappear around the bend, and the daily rhythm inside the walls began to shift almost at once. George Percy took over as the new president of the council. He was a capable gentleman with military experience from earlier campaigns in Europe, but his approach differed from Smith's in important ways. Percy preferred to consult the full council on most decisions, and did not enforce the same strict requirement that every man complete a full day's labour before receiving his full share of food. Some of the gentlemen who had chafed under Smith's rules now found it easier to assign the heavier tasks to the labourers and servants while they attended to what they considered more suitable duties. The tallies of work performed grew less precise, and the storehouse records showed that supplies were being drawn down faster than they had been only weeks earlier. It was almost as if the colony had decided, in Smith's absence, that the old ways of stretching every bushel of corn had been a bit too tiresome after all. With the change in leadership, small disagreements that Smith had settled quickly now lingered. Arguments arose over who should stand the night watches and whether certain tools should be reserved for the craftsmen rather than lent to the general work gangs. The carpenters still repaired roofs and the gardeners still tended the plots beyond the walls, but the overall pace slowed. Percy tried to maintain order by calling regular council meetings and issuing general instructions, yet without one strong voice directing each team, the fort's routine lost some of its earlier steadiness. The new president focused on keeping the palisade in repair and making sure the guards had powder and shot ready, but the daily labour details no longer carried the same weight they once had. At the same time, news of Smith's departure travelled inland along the native trails faster than any English messenger could have managed. Chief Powhatan received word at his main village that the one Englishman he had dealt with most directly was gone. The chief had long balanced trade with caution, providing enough corn to keep the fort dependent while preventing the settlers from spreading too far. With Smith no longer there to lead the bargaining parties or map the country, Powhatan saw an opportunity to tighten his control over the surrounding land and resources. He sent runners to the villages closest to the James River, with instructions to reduce the amounts of corn and beans offered to the English and to watch carefully for any parties leaving the fort. The flow of food that had arrived in steady baskets throughout the previous months slowed to a trickle. English foraging groups soon noticed the change. When they approached the nearest villages, they found the fields already harvested and the storehouses closed. Warriors stood at the edges of the clearings, bows ready but not yet drawn, making it clear that further movement inland would not be tolerated without permission. Small clashes began at the edges of the woods. A party sent out for firewood returned with arrows embedded in their cart, and another group searching for clams along the riverbank came under sudden attack that forced them to drop their baskets and run. Percy ordered the gates kept shut more often, and limited the size of any party allowed outside the walls. The river, once a highway for trade canoes, now carried fewer native boats, and those that did appear stayed well clear of the landing stage. Inside the fort, the reduced trade meant tighter rations almost immediately. The corn that had once filled the raised granary now had to stretch further, and the men began mixing it with smaller amounts of the remaining ship's biscuit and dried peas. Fishing continued, but the catches grew leaner as the season advanced and the water cooled. Hunters who slipped out at dawn returned empty-handed more often than not, because the deer and turkey had been driven farther away by the Powhatan activity. Percy and the council tried to organise larger, guarded expeditions, yet each one carried the risk of ambush and used up precious powder and lead that could not easily be replaced. The settlers who had grown used to Smith's steady supply of native corn now faced the quiet realisation that dependence on trade had left them vulnerable once that trade stopped. The Powhatan strategy unfolded methodically. Warriors moved into positions around the fort at a distance, keeping just out of musket range but close enough to be seen at the tree line when the light was right. They did not launch a full assault. Instead, they made travel dangerous and kept the English penned inside the triangular enclosure. Messages from farther villages confirmed that Powhatan had ordered all tribute and trade with the newcomers halted until the English showed signs of weakening or leaving. The chief understood that the fort's population had grown during the year, and that its stores, even with careful management, could not last an entire winter without outside help. By restricting movement and food, he aimed to force the settlers into a position where they would either abandon the place or become too weak to threaten his people's lands. Percy responded by strengthening the guard rotations and sending out scouts in small numbers to test the blockade. These patrols sometimes returned with a few ears of corn taken from an unguarded field, but more often they came back with reports of warriors watching from cover. The council debated whether to send a ship back to England with an urgent request for supplies, yet the vessels that remained were needed to carry the season's small cargo of clapboard and sassafras, if the colony hoped to show any return on the company's investment. In the meantime, the men repaired the palisade where winter storms had loosened stakes and dug additional pits for storing whatever roots or nuts could be gathered close to the walls. The routine of labour continued, but the earlier sense of steady progress under Smith had given way to a watchful caution. As the leaves fell and the days shortened, the tensions outside the fort became part of daily life inside as well. Men spoke less during meals and kept their eyes on the tree line whenever they stepped into the open lanes. The few women and children present helped with the smaller tasks, mending clothes, grinding the dwindling corn, and tending the fires, but everyone felt the change in atmosphere. Percy kept the council informed of each new report from the scouts, and decisions were made collectively. Yet the absence of one decisive leader meant that responses sometimes came slower than the situation required. The Powhatan had chosen their moment well. With Smith gone and the new leadership still settling in, the fort found itself increasingly isolated from the resources it had come to rely on. The river flowed past the landing stage as it always had, but now the water carried fewer signs of friendly traffic. Occasional canoes appeared in the distance, yet they turned away before coming close enough for any exchange. Inside the walls, the storehouse doors stayed closed longer each day, and the portions served at the common kettles grew noticeably smaller. The settlers who had once complained about Smith's strict rules now missed the security those rules had provided. The fort remained standing, its palisade intact and its gates barred at night, but the balance that had kept hunger at bay had begun to tip. The growing tensions with the Powhatan and the loss of firm leadership marked the quiet beginning of a harder season than any the colony had yet faced. The arrival of new settlers, the autumn of 1609 approached, and the Powhatan watchers kept their distance at the tree line. The river brought an unexpected sight, one clear morning in August. Lookouts on the palisade called out when 7 sails appeared downstream, moving steadily with the tide. These were the remaining vessels of the Third Supply Fleet that had left England months earlier under a reorganised Virginia Company charter. The flagship Sea Venture, carrying the new Lieutenant Governor Sir Thomas Gates and the bulk of the planned provisions, had separated in a storm and not yet arrived. The other ships, the Blessing, the Lion, the Falcon, and several smaller ones, had pressed on after the scattering and now anchored off the landing stage with roughly 400 additional colonists aboard. The fort's population, already under strain from reduced trade, suddenly doubled in a single day. The newcomers stepped ashore in waves, their legs unsteady after the long Atlantic crossing. Many were gentlemen expecting to claim land and live comfortably, while others included artisans, labourers, and for the first time a noticeable number of women and children. They carried bundles of personal belongings, tools, and a limited supply of meal and salted meat that had survived the voyage. Percy and the council stood at the gate to welcome them, reading the company's letters aloud in the open square. The documents announced a new structure of government with Gates at its head once he reached the colony. But for the moment the instructions called for the settlers to expand the fort and prepare fields for a larger harvest. The arrival felt like a promise of stability, a sign that London had not forgotten the struggling outpost on the James River. Unloading began immediately and continued through the afternoon and into the next days. Barrels of grain, casks of wine, and crates of iron tools were rolled up the bank and stacked inside the palisade. Livestock, more pigs and a few goats were driven from the ships and turned loose to forage beyond the walls. The new colonists helped with the work, though many moved slowly from the effects of the voyage. The triangular enclosure filled with activity as tents and temporary shelters went up along the lanes to house the extra people. The storehouse doors swung open wider than they had in weeks, and the council ordered an initial distribution of the fresh supplies to stretch the existing corn a little further. For a brief time the fort buzzed with the kind of energy that had marked the very first landings 2 years earlier, as if the arrival of so many hands might finally tip the balance towards self-sufficiency. The hope proved short-lived once the full count was made. The 400 new arrivals brought mouths that needed feeding at once, and the ships had carried far less food than planned, because part of the cargo had gone down with the sea venture. Percy called a council meeting the same evening to divide the newcomers into work teams and assign them quarters, yet the existing huts and houses could not hold everyone. Some families slept under canvas or in the open church building until more structures could be framed. The gardens outside the walls, already raided by deer and watched by Powhatan scouts, would have to feed twice as many once winter came. Fishing parties doubled in size, yet the river's daily catch remained the same, so each portion grew smaller when divided among the larger company. Daily routines shifted to accommodate the sudden growth. The new settlers joined the existing teams for chopping firewood, clearing additional ground, and repairing the palisade where recent rains had softened the earth. Gentlemen among the arrivals often stood alongside labourers for the first time, learning to swing an axe or carry water buckets under Percy's quieter direction. The women helped organise cooking fires and mend the torn sails that had been brought ashore for patching roofs. Children carried kindling and fetched river water, their smaller tasks easing the load on the adults, yet the extra labour did not immediately produce extra food. The storehouse records showed the grain disappearing faster than it could be replaced, and the council had to set stricter limits on how much could be taken each day. It was almost as if the company in London had calculated the numbers on paper without quite picturing how quickly 500 people could empty a barrel of meal. Relations with the Powhatan, already tense, grew more complicated with the larger population visible from the woods. Native scouts observed the increased activity at the landing stage and the new smoke rising from extra fires inside the fort. Trading visits, already reduced, stopped almost entirely after the ships arrived. A few canoes appeared at a distance but turned away before any exchange could be attempted. Percy sent small guarded parties to the nearest villages with the usual gifts of copper and beads, yet they returned with empty baskets and reports of closed granaries. The chief had clearly decided that feeding this many English would only encourage them to stay and spread. The newcomers, unaware of the earlier balance Smith had maintained, asked why the locals no longer brought corn as expected, and the veterans could only explain that the rules of trade had changed once the fort looked stronger and fuller. Inside the walls the strain showed in small but steady ways. The river water, always brackish at high tide, now had to serve more kettles and more laundry. Sickness from the voyage spread through the crowded quarters, adding to the fevers already present. The surgeon worked longer hours with the same limited medicines, while the women boiled herbs gathered near the palisade to make weak broths for the ill. Rations were measured with greater care at each meal, corn porridge thinned with water, a sliver of salted pork if any remained, and whatever fish could be cleaned and shared. The council tried to keep spirits steady by reminding everyone of the new charter and the promised arrival of gates, but the practical truth was that the fort had gained people faster than it had gained resources. Work on new buildings continued through the late summer days. Carpenters from the fresh arrivals framed additional houses using timber felled just beyond the walls, while labourers mixed clay for daubing the wattle. The expanded palisade required more stakes and more earth to raise the bank, so teams laboured in shifts from dawn until the light faded. Yet each new structure meant another hearth that needed fuel, and another family that needed food. The pigs brought ashore rooted through the cleared ground, and provided some meat when one was slaughtered, but their numbers were too few to make a lasting difference. Fishing remained the steadiest source of fresh provisions, with larger crews rowing the shallop out each morning, and returning with nets full of perch or catfish that were divided equally at the common kettles. The arrival also brought letters and instructions that altered the colony's plans. The company expected the settlers to plant more English crops and to search for minerals or other commodities to send back on the returning ships. Percy read the orders to the assembled company in the square, and the new colonists nodded at the prospect of future profits. For the moment, however, the orders had to wait while the council focused on housing and feeding the immediate population. Some of the gentlemen among the newcomers suggested sending a small party farther upriver to trade or explore, but Percy reminded them of the Powhatan watchers and the risk of losing more men. The fort stayed closed more often, its gates barred at dusk and the guards doubled on the parapets. By the end of August, the ships had unloaded everything they carried and prepared to sail back to England, with whatever clapboard and sassafras the colony could spare. The departure left the enlarged settlement feeling both fuller and more exposed. The new faces had brought fresh energy and new skills, tailors who could mend clothing properly, coopers who repaired barrels, and farmers who knew how to lay out larger fields. But they had also doubled the demand on every resource inside the triangular enclosure. The storehouse, briefly stocked, began to show gaps on its shelves again. The river flowed past the landing stage as usual, carrying the empty ships downstream, while the people remaining behind faced the coming autumn with more hands to work and far more mouths to feed. The council adjusted the daily teams to include the newcomers fully, rotating them through the hardest tasks so no group felt singled out. Women and children settled into their roles around the fires and gardens, adding a different rhythm to the lanes that had once been filled mostly with men. Yet the hope that had arrived with the sails slowly gave way to the steady calculation of how long the remaining grain and fish would last. Percy kept the records carefully and called meetings to review the stores each week, but even the most optimistic figures showed that the winter ahead would test the larger company more severely than any season before. The fort stood solid, its walls extended where possible, yet the balance between people and provisions had tilted sharply with the arrival of those 7 ships. The newcomers gradually learned the routines of guard duty, foraging close to the walls and mending tools with whatever iron remained. They heard stories from the veterans about Smith's earlier trades and the careful mapping of the country, and they began to understand why the Powhatan had grown cautious. The fort had become a busier place, with more voices at the kettles and more lanterns lit along the lanes at night. But the extra activity did not hide the simple fact that resources were now spread thinner than ever. Autumn leaves started to turn, and the river carried the first cooler winds, reminding everyone that the season of plenty was ending and the test of endurance was only beginning. The Powhatan strategy. With the new ships gone and the enlarged company settled inside the fort, Chief Powhatan made his decision clear through actions rather than words. Messengers moved quietly between his villages along well-worn trails, carrying instructions that trade with the English would stop and that any movement outside the palisade would be watched and opposed. The chief had observed the steady growth of the settlement for more than 2 years and had calculated that feeding so many newcomers would only encourage them to clear more land and push farther into his territory. By cutting off the flow of corn, beans and fish, he aimed to force the English to weaken through hunger or to abandon the James River altogether. The strategy was patient and coordinated. Relying on the warriors' knowledge of the woods and the natural barriers of river and marsh, warriors took up positions in small groups at the edges of the cleared ground around the fort. They stayed just beyond easy musket range, appearing at dawn or dusk when the light made them hard to count accurately. From these vantage points they could see the gates open and close, note the size of any party sent out for wood or water, and signal to one another with bird calls or smoke from small fires. When English foragers ventured even a short distance for nuts or roots, arrows flew from cover without warning, striking the ground near their feet or embedding in trees to drive them back. No full attack came, only these sharp reminders that the surrounding country no longer belonged to the settlers for free use. The Powhatan avoided open battle where English firearms held an advantage, choosing instead to make every step outside the walls risky and costly in time and nerve. Inside the fort, the council noticed the change within days. Percy sent small, well-armed groups to the nearest villages with the usual gifts, but the clearings stood empty of people and the granaries were shut. The few Powhatan who appeared at a distance carried no baskets and offered no greeting. When one party tried to dig in an abandoned field, they returned with only a handful of ears and several arrows in their cart. The river, once busy with trading canoes, now showed only occasional distant sails of native boats that turned away before coming close. Percy ordered the gates kept shut except for necessary work details, and he doubled the guard on the parapets so that lookouts could spot movement in the tree line before it came too near. The fort began to feel more like an island than a foothold in the land. The strategy affected daily tasks in practical ways. Wood-cutting teams could no longer range far for the best dry timber, and had to make do with smaller trees closer to the walls, which meant more frequent trips and greater exposure. Fishing crews still rowed the shallop into the river each morning, but they stayed nearer the fort and kept weapons ready, reducing the time they could spend on the best grounds. Gardens beyond the palisade required constant watching, and even then deer and raiding parties sometimes took the young plants before they could be harvested. The women and children who helped tend the plots learned to work quickly and return inside at the first sign of movement in the woods. Every activity now carried the extra weight of caution, and the simple chores that had once filled the daylight hours took longer and yielded less. Powhatan's control extended through the network of villages under his authority. Each local leader received orders to withhold surplus food and to report any English movement in their area. Runners carried news back to the main village so the chief could track how the settlers responded. This system allowed the Powhatan to act together without needing a large standing force near the fort. Warriors rotated in and out of the watching positions, returning to their own fields and longhouses for rest and food while others took their place. The English, penned inside their triangle of walls, had no clear way to strike back at an enemy they could rarely see and never quite count. Percy and the council debated sending a larger expedition to force open a trade route, but the risk of losing men and powder in unfamiliar woods made them hesitate. As September gave way to October, the effects of the tightened strategy became harder to ignore. The storehouse shelves showed gaps where full barrels had once stood, and the daily porridge at the common kettles grew thinner with each passing week. The new settlers, still adjusting to the routines, asked more questions about why the Powhatan had suddenly turned unfriendly, and the veterans explained the earlier dependence on trade and the balance Smith had maintained. Some of the gentlemen suggested that a show of force might bring the natives back to the bargaining table, but Percy reminded them that the company's instructions called for peaceful relations whenever possible, and that the colony could not afford heavy losses. The council settled instead for strengthening the defences and rationing what remained with greater care. The Powhatan did not rely on hunger alone. They also drove game away from the vicinity of the fort by hunting the deer and turkey in the nearby woods themselves, or by making enough noise and movement to scatter the animals farther inland. English hunters who slipped out before first light returned with empty hands more often than not, their powder and shot better saved for defence than spent on distant shots. The river itself offered some relief, but catches of fish and shellfish decreased as the water cooled and the larger sturgeon moved to deeper channels. The settlers turned to whatever could be gathered close to the walls: acorns, persimmons when they could be reached safely, and the last roots dug from the garden plots. Each small addition helped stretch the stores, yet the total fell short of what 500 people required through the coming cold months. Winter preparations continued under the watchful eyes from the tree line. Men split extra firewood and stacked it inside the palisade where it could not be easily burned or stolen. The carpenters repaired every leak in the roofs and strengthened the gates with heavier timbers. The women mended clothing and blankets, turning worn wool and linen into layers that might hold warmth when the rains turned colder. Children carried smaller loads of kindling and helped grind the dwindling corn into meal. Percy kept the records of stores updated at each council meeting, and the figures told a clear story. Without new supplies from outside, the fort would face real hardship before spring arrived. The new charter and the expected arrival of Gates offered some hope, but the ships from Bermuda had not yet appeared, and no one could be certain when relief would come. The strategy also tested the discipline inside the walls. With food portions shrinking, small disagreements over shares surfaced again, though Percy and the council worked to settle them quickly and fairly. The presence of more families meant that the needs of women and children had to be weighed alongside those of the working men, adding another layer to the daily calculations. Some of the recent arrivals suggested trying to slip past the watchers at night to reach distant villages, but the council forbade such attempts after the first try ended with a wounded man and no food gained. The fort settled into a quieter, more watchful routine, its people moving between tasks with fewer words and more glances toward the surrounding woods. By late autumn, the Powhatan had achieved their immediate aim. The English remained inside the triangular enclosure, their movements limited and their stores diminishing week by week. Warriors still appeared at the edges of the cleared ground, enough to keep the settlers cautious, but not so many as to invite a direct assault. The chief continued to receive reports from his runners and adjusted the pressure according to what he learned about conditions inside the fort. The strategy was not one of quick victory, but of steady erosion, counting on hunger and isolation to do the work that open battle might have cost in lives on both sides. The river flowed past the landing stage under grey skies, carrying fallen leaves downstream, while inside the walls the company faced the reality that the land around them had become less giving and more dangerous than it had seemed only months before. The settlers responded with the only means left to them: careful rationing, stronger guards, and the quiet hope that the delayed ships from Bermuda would arrive before the worst of winter set in. The Powhatan strategy had changed the balance once again, turning the fort from a growing settlement into a place under quiet siege. Each day brought the same tasks: chopping wood, mending tools, tending the small gardens, but now every action carried the knowledge that the surrounding country was no longer open for free use. The triangular palisade stood as the boundary between the English and a world that had decided, for the time being, to withhold its help. The starving time begins. The first hard frosts arrived in early November, and with them the last traces of the autumn stores disappeared from the common kettles. Percy and the council measured what remained in the raised granary and divided it into the smallest portions that could still be called a meal: a handful of cornmeal thinned with river water, perhaps a scrap of salted pork if the barrel still held any, and nothing more. The 500 people inside the triangular enclosure now faced the simple fact that the Powhatan watchers at the tree line had succeeded in their plan. No new corn arrived, no trading canoes appeared on the river, and the ships from Bermuda had not yet been sighted. The fort settled into a quieter rhythm, one measured not by work teams but by the slow emptying of every container that once held food. Each morning the council posted the day's ration at the storehouse door so there would be no arguments over fairness. The men who still had strength formed small parties and searched the ground immediately outside the palisade for anything that might be eaten acorns that had fallen in the previous weeks. a few late persimmons still clinging to branches, or the roots of wild plants that could be dug with a spade before the soil froze solid. These parties moved quickly and stayed within sight of the guards on the parapets, because arrows could still come from the woods without warning. What they brought back was added to the common pot and boiled until it softened enough to swallow. The river continued to offer fish, but the catches grew smaller as the water turned colder, and the crews had to row farther out while keeping one eye on the distant shore. By mid-November, the livestock inside the fort had become the next source of sustenance. The pigs and goats that had been brought ashore in August were slaughtered one by one in the open square, their meat divided with careful precision so that every family received an equal share. The horses, which had once pulled carts and carried exploring parties, were led to the blockhouse and killed in turn. Their flesh was roasted over slow fires and the bones cracked for marrow. The dogs that had guarded the gates and the cats that had kept the storehouse free of rats followed the same path. The settlers discovered, with a touch of dry humour in the telling later, that their boots, which had once carried them proudly through English streets, now provided a surprisingly durable addition to the evening meal once the leather was boiled long enough to chew. Belts, pouches, and even the stiff collars stiffened with starch were cut into strips and added to the kettles when nothing else remained. The weather turned steadily colder as December arrived. Rain gave way to sleet that coated the palisade stakes and made the lanes slippery underfoot. Fires burned constantly in the huts, but wood had to be conserved, so the flames stayed low and the rooms remained damp and chilly. Men, women, and children huddled under whatever blankets or cloaks could be layered together, their breath visible in the thin morning light. Sickness spread faster in these conditions. Dysentery and fevers moved from one shelter to the next, weakening bodies already thinned by hunger. The surgeon worked by lantern light with the last of the medicines, but most care fell to the women who boiled what herbs could still be gathered near the walls. Burials outside the palisade became a daily occurrence. The graves dug shallow in the frozen ground and marked only by simple wooden crosses that soon disappeared under fresh snow. Inside the fort, the daily search for anything edible continued without pause. Small groups ventured a little farther when the watchers seemed quiet, returning with snakes caught in the underbrush, mice trapped in the storehouse corners, or handfuls of bark stripped from young trees. These items were cleaned, boiled, and shared without complaint, because every scrap added another day of life. Percy kept careful records of the stores and the number of deaths, noting each loss in the council book so the company in London would later understand the scale of the hardship. The new settlers who had arrived with such hope in August now moved more slowly, their faces hollow and their clothing hanging loose on frames that had once filled out English doublets and breeches. The lanes between the houses grew quiet except for the sound of coughing and the occasional call for water. January brought the deepest part of the winter. The river froze along the edges, making fishing impossible on many days. The last of the grain was gone, and the kettles held only what could be scavenged or boiled from hides. Men who still had the strength to stand kept the guard rotations going, their muskets loaded with the remaining powder, but aimed more often at shadows in the woods than at any visible threat. The Powhatan strategy held firm. Occasional fires could be seen at night in the tree line, a reminder that the watchers had not left their posts. No one inside the fort spoke of surrender, but the council meetings grew shorter and more practical, focused entirely on how to stretch the next day's findings. Children helped by gathering twigs for the fires and carrying small loads of snow to melt for water, their small hands doing what they could to support the adults. February saw the death rate climb higher. Bodies weakened by months of short rations gave way to the constant cold and the steady march of illness. The triangular enclosure, once bustling with building and planting, now held long stretches of silence broken only by the sounds of survival. Huts that had housed families stood half empty, their roofs patched with whatever scraps remained. The women continued to mend clothing with thread unravelled from old sails, turning every garment into something that could hold a little more warmth. The men who could still work repaired the palisade where frost had heaved the stakes loose, knowing that the walls were the only thing keeping the watchers at bay. Each new grave outside the gate was dug with tools grown dull from constant use, and the living returned to the fort with the quiet understanding that the numbers were falling faster than anyone had expected. Through these months the river remained the one constant. It flowed past the landing stage under a covering of ice near the banks, carrying occasional driftwood that could be pulled ashore for fuel. The shallop stayed tied at the dock, its hull now used to store what little remained of the tools and spare canvas. Percy and the council reviewed the situation at every meeting, calculating how many weeks the current pace of scavenging might last. They posted guards at the river gate in case a ship from Bermuda appeared, but the horizon stayed empty. The fort had become a closed world of its own, its people turning every corner of the enclosure and the immediate ground beyond into a source of whatever could sustain life for one more day. The early weeks of spring in 1610 brought no relief at first. The ground softened enough for a few wild greens to push through, and parties gathered them carefully before they could be trampled or taken by animals. The river ice broke up and fishing resumed, though the catches were still modest, yet the damage of the long winter was already done. The company that had numbered more than 500 in the late summer now stood at barely 60 souls, still able to move about the lanes. The survivors moved with slow, deliberate steps, their eyes marked by exhaustion and their voices reduced to quiet necessities. The storehouse stood nearly empty, its raised floor swept clean of the last kernels. The palisade remained intact, its gates still barred at night, but the buildings inside showed the wear of months without proper maintenance. The starving time had taken hold in full by the turn of the year, and had carried the colony through its longest and most difficult season yet. The combination of the Powhatan Blockade, the late arrival of supplies, and the simple limits of what the land could provide in one winter had reduced the settlement to a handful of determined people holding on inside the wooden walls. Percy continued to keep the records straight, noting each day's small gains and losses so the story could be told accurately when help finally came. The river flowed past as it always had, now free of ice and carrying the first warmer winds, while inside the fort the survivors waited for the next sign that the world beyond the James River had not forgotten them entirely. The first terrible months had passed, leaving the triangular enclosure standing, but its people thinned and tested in ways no one in England could yet imagine. The survivors inside the triangular enclosure moved through each day with a measured pace that left no room for wasted effort. Dawn came with the first grey light filtering through the patched roofs, and those still able rose from their shared bedding of straw and cloaks to face the same narrow set of tasks. Percy had the council post the day's ration list at the storehouse before the light grew strong, so the company gathered quietly at the common kettles for the single small serving that would carry them until evening. The portions were measured with a wooden scoop, whatever roots or scraps had been gathered the previous afternoon, boiled into a thin broth. No one lingered over the meal. The bowls were emptied and returned to the women who managed the fires, and the day's work began at once. Small parties formed for the morning search. Men who retained enough strength took turns walking the ground just beyond the palisade, eyes scanning for anything the frost had not yet claimed. They carried short spades and baskets, moving in pairs so one could keep watch while the other dug. The ground near the walls yielded a few hardy roots or the last dried berries that had clung to bushes through the cold. These finds went straight into the common pot for the next ration. Fishing crews pushed the shallop out when the river ice had broken enough, but they stayed close to the landing stage and returned with only modest catches of perch or catfish that were cleaned on the spot and added to the stores. The routine never varied. Every hand that could work did so, because the alternative was simply to weaken faster. As the hours passed, the women handled the steady indoor tasks that kept the shelters livable. They mended tears in the remaining blankets with thread pulled from old sail canvas, boiled snow for drinking water when the river edge froze, and tended the few who had fallen ill overnight. Children moved among the huts carrying small loads of firewood or helping to sweep the lanes clear of the previous night's debris. Their steps were careful and their voices low, because the quiet of the fort had become part of the daily atmosphere. The guards on the parapets changed every few hours, each man taking his turn with a musket across his knees, eyes on the tree line where the Powhatan watchers still appeared at intervals. The presence of those distant figures had become so ordinary that the guards no longer pointed them out unless movement grew closer. This was the period when the differences in background that had once shaped life in the colony stood out most sharply against the common hardship. The company had always reflected the social classes familiar in early 17th century England, carried across the ocean and adapted to the frontier. Gentlemen made up a noticeable portion of the original and later arrivals. They had come expecting to direct rather than perform manual labour, and in ordinary times they wore woolen doublets with slashed sleeves, fitted breeches, knitted stockings, and felt hats trimmed with narrow bands. Their habits leaned toward oversight, reviewing accounts, writing reports, and planning future fields while servants attended to their personal needs. Labourers and soldiers formed the larger working group. These men arrived in coarser canvas jerkins, plain linen shirts, loose breeches of heavy cloth, and sturdy leather shoes or boots that could withstand mud and wear. They were accustomed to long hours of physical effort, whether swinging an axe or standing watch, and their daily routine had always centred on the practical chores that kept the fort standing. A smaller number of women, mostly wives or servants of the settlers, managed household matters in simple wool gowns with linen aprons and coifs covering their hair. Children dressed in scaled-down versions of adult clothing, learning tasks early to contribute to the common effort. Food in more stable times reflected these backgrounds as well. Gentlemen favoured salted beef or pork from ship stores, wheat bread or porridge when grain allowed, and whatever fresh fish supplemented the table. Labourers ate heartier portions of the same staples, often with native corn ground into meal that the Powhatan had traded in better seasons. Popular dishes included boiled puddings of barley and peas, roasted meat when available, and stews thickened with beans or squash learned from local fields. Clothing and food alike suited the English climate and expectations, though the Virginia heat and damp quickly showed their limits. By the worst months of the starving time, those distinctions had not vanished but had grown irrelevant in practice. The gentlemen now swung spades alongside the labourers because every pair of hands counted the same when searching for roots. Doublets and breeches that once marked status hung loose and patched on thinned frames, their wool frayed from constant use, and their stockings darned until the original colour was lost. Canvas jerkins and leather boots fared little better. Many had been cut into strips for the kettles when nothing else remained, leaving feet wrapped in rags or crude coverings of bark. The women's gowns, once neat and serviceable, showed the same wear. Aprons turned into bandages or added to the boiling pots. Children's clothing had been repurposed entirely. Small shirts and breeches cut down further to cover the youngest, or mended into blankets. The food that had once arrived in barrels or baskets now existed only in memory. The salted beef and wheat porridge of earlier days had given way to whatever the ground or river surrendered each morning. The contrast served as a quiet reminder, noted later in the records, that circumstances could erase the outward signs of class faster than any council decree, leaving only the shared need to see the next sunrise. Midday brought a brief pause for rest in the shelters. Those who could manage it sat near the low fires, sharing the smallest additional scrap if the morning search had been fortunate. Conversation stayed practical reports of where a few greens had been spotted or which section of the palisade needed propping after the night's frost. The surgeon made his rounds with the last of the salves, checking wounds and fevers while the women prepared herbal infusions from the few dried leaves still stored. Percy walked the lanes at this hour, stopping at each group to note the condition of the stores and the number of able bodies for the afternoon tasks. The council met briefly in the church building, reviewing the previous day's burials and adjusting the next morning's search parties so no area near the walls went unchecked. Afternoon work resumed with the same steady focus. Parties repaired what could be fixed, tightening ropes on the shallop, sharpening the few remaining tools, or stacking firewood closer to the huts for easier access after dark. The river provided the one steady rhythm. Even when catches were small, The crews returned and cleaned the fish at the landing stage, dividing the pieces for the evening kettles. Guards on the parapets kept their posts, occasionally firing a warning shot when a watcher ventured too close, though powder was saved for genuine need. The women and children gathered snow or river water to refill barrels, boiling it over the fires to make it safe. Every action fit into the narrow window of daylight, because once darkness fell, the fort locked down and movement outside the huts became rare. Evening arrived with the final ration of the day, again taken at the common kettles under the council's watch. The broth or thin stew was consumed slowly, each spoonful stretched as long as possible. Afterward the company returned to the shelters, layering what remained of blankets and cloaks against the night cold. Fires burned low to conserve wood, and the lanes fell silent except for the occasional cough or the tread of the night guard. Percy reviewed the day's tallies by lantern light, entering the numbers of deaths and the small gains from foraging into the company book. The records grew shorter with each passing week, yet they continued without fail, because the council understood that accuracy mattered even when survival itself hung in balance. The routines carried a certain dry practicality that the settlers later recalled with a touch of wry acknowledgement. Hunger had a way of simplifying every decision to its barest form. Gentlemen who had once debated land grants now discussed the best way to boil a strip of hide. Labourers who had swung axes for wages now used the same tools to pry loose any root that might yield a meal. The women who had kept English households now managed a single shared fire for the entire shelter row. Children learned to spot edible plants faster than many adults, their small size allowing them to reach places the larger search parties missed. The clothing that had defined roles back in England now served only to hold warmth or provide one more scrap for the pot. The food that had once arrived seasoned and plentiful existed only as the memory of better seasons, replaced by the plain necessity of whatever the day offered. Night watches passed in quiet turns, each man alert for sounds beyond the palisade. The Powhatan fires could sometimes be seen flickering at the tree line, a steady reminder that the strategy of isolation continued. Inside, the company rested as best it could, bodies conserving strength for the next dawn's search. The triangular fort, once a place of building and planting, had become a compact world of survival measured in small daily increments. The river flowed past the landing stage under the winter stars, carrying the cold air downstream, while the people within the walls followed the same unvarying pattern that kept them alive one more day at a time. By the time the days began to lengthen in early spring, the pattern had worn deep grooves into every habit. Search parties knew exactly which patches of ground near the walls still held promise. The kettles received their contents with the same careful division. Guards rotated without need for spoken orders. The social classes that had once ordered life so distinctly now blended into the single effort of endurance, their clothing and former foods reduced to distant recollections that surfaced only in quiet moments. Daily life had settled into this steady, unadorned rhythm, each sunrise bringing the same tasks and the same quiet hope that the next search or the next catch might add a little more to the common stores. The fort stood as it had through the long months, its people moving through the lanes with the deliberate care that came from knowing every action counted. Cannibalism and survival as the deepest weeks of winter settled over the fort, and even the daily searches near the palisade yielded almost nothing new. A few among the survivors turned to measures that had never been part of any plan brought from England. The council kept its records with the same steady hand Percy had used from the beginning, noting each small change in the stores and the number of those still able to move about the lanes. What those pages could not capture, however, were the private decisions made in the quieter corners of the huts when the last scrap from the common kettles had been shared and the fires burned too low to offer comfort. Later writings from Percy himself described these moments without exaggeration, simply laying out what he had seen and heard, so the company in London would understand the full extent of the trial. One account that Percy set down concerned a man who had lost his wife to the steady march of illness and hunger. In the privacy of their shelter, with no one else present, The husband took the only step he could imagine to stretch the remaining days for himself. He prepared the body in the same manner that meat had once been handled in the storehouse, salting what could be preserved and using the rest at once. Percy learned of the matter when the man was discovered and brought before the council. The act was not widespread. It remained the choice of one individual pushed beyond the ordinary limits of endurance. The council handled the case quietly, recording the facts without public spectacle, because the fort had already seen enough death that adding judgment seemed pointless when survival itself hung by so thin a thread. Other instances followed a similar private pattern. Small groups or solitary figures separated from the main company by the layout of the huts or the exhaustion of the day made use of bodies that had already been laid out for burial. These were not acts of violence against the living, but quiet decisions over those who had already passed. Percy noted them in his journal as part of the larger picture of desperation, careful to distinguish them from any suggestion that the entire company had descended into the same practice. The records show that most survivors continued to rely on the same painstaking searches for roots, the occasional fish from the river, and the last bits of boiled leather or bark. The extreme steps remained rare, taken by those who felt they had no other path forward, and who kept their actions hidden as long as possible. Years afterward, when archaeologists working at the Jamestown site uncovered remains from the exact period of the starving time, the physical evidence confirmed what the written accounts had described in measured terms. In one pit near the fort's interior, excavators found the partial skeleton of a young girl, roughly 14 years old, who had been given the name Jane for the project records. Her bones carried clear-cut marks made by a knife or similar tool, particularly around the skull and the leg bones. The pattern showed that flesh had been removed in a deliberate way, and some of the bones had been heated in a way that suggested they had been placed in a cooking vessel. The girl had arrived with the later supply ships and had lived through the first months of the enlarged population before the shortages took their toll. Her remains offered no name or personal story, only the quiet testimony of what had occurred in one desperate instance inside the enclosure. The archaeologists who examined the marks noted that the cuts were precise, not frenzied, matching the careful preparation seen in other food processing from the period. These findings did not suggest that cannibalism had become the main source of sustenance for the colony. The vast majority of the bones recovered from the site continued to show the consumption of horses, dogs, rats, and the local wildlife that could still be taken near the walls. The leather and starch from clothing appeared in the archaeological layers as well, consistent with the daily searches described in the council records. Jane's skeleton stood as one clear example among the larger story of survival, a single case that matched the private accounts Percy had recorded. The discovery, made centuries later with modern tools and careful analysis, gave later generations a direct look at the lengths to which a few had gone when every other option had been exhausted. Inside the fort, the council continued its quiet oversight. Percy made certain that the common kettles remained the centre of shared rations, and he encouraged the able-bodied to focus their efforts on the collective searches rather than private measures. The guards on the parapets kept their watches, and the small parties still went out each morning under the same rules that had governed the earlier months. When instances like the one Percy described came to light, the council addressed them without ceremony, recording the details and returning the focus to the daily tasks that kept the rest of the company moving forward. The dry practicality of the time showed itself again here. History had placed the settlers in a corner no charter from London had anticipated, and the response remained the same steady accounting that had guided them since the first winter. As February gave way to March, the river began to loosen its grip on the ice. Fishing crews could venture a little farther once more, and the first faint signs of green appeared in the ground closest to the walls. The searches now included a few early shoots that could be added to the broth, though the quantities remained too small to reverse the steady loss of strength. The population inside the triangular enclosure had fallen to the point where the lanes felt emptier than at any time since the ships had arrived the previous August. Those who still walked carried the marks of the long months in their slowed movements and the way their clothing hung without shape. The women continued the indoor work of mending and boiling water, while the children helped with the smallest loads of firewood or snow. The fort had become a compact circle of endurance, its people conserving every bit of energy for the next search or the next guard turn. The Powhatan watchers remained at the tree line, their fires visible on clearer nights, yet they made no move to enter the enclosure. Their strategy had done its work, and the reduced numbers inside the palisade told the story without need for further action. Percy kept the records current, noting the slight improvement in river catches and the handful of new greens that appeared each week. The council meetings grew shorter, focused now on the practical question of how long the remaining company could hold until the expected ships arrived. No one spoke of the private cases in open discussion. The facts had been set down, and the daily effort continued as it had before. By the middle of April, the ground had softened enough for a few more roots to be dug, and the river yielded a steadier supply of fish. The survivors began to speak of the possibility that the Bermuda ships might still reach them before the last reserves gave out. The council organised the able men into teams again, not for grand building projects but for the simple repair of the shallop and the strengthening of the gates against the weakening palisade stakes. The women prepared the shelters for slightly warmer nights, and the children carried water with a touch more steadiness than in the coldest weeks. The extreme measures that had occurred in the depth of winter did not repeat as the days lengthened. The company returned to the shared routine that had carried them this far. The archaeological layers from the site later showed the same gradual shift. The cut marks on Jane's bones belonged to the height of the shortages, while the bones from the later weeks of the period reflected a return to fish, small game, and the first wild plants. The fort's records and the physical evidence together painted a consistent picture, a handful of desperate acts amid a larger story of collective endurance. Percy's accounts and the later excavations both emphasised that the colony had not collapsed entirely. It had held on through the narrowest margin, its people turning to every resource the situation offered, whether expected or unforeseen. The river flowed past the landing stage with the first warmer currents, carrying driftwood that could be gathered for fuel without the same risk as before. The guards still watched the tree line, but the Powhatan presence felt less immediate as the weeks advanced. Inside the enclosure, the daily searches continued, now bringing back enough to keep the kettles from emptying entirely. The company that remained 60 or so souls moved with the quiet knowledge that they had passed through the longest test the fort had yet faced. The darkest moments had come and gone, recorded in private journals and confirmed centuries later by careful study of the ground itself. The triangular walls stood as they had, enclosing a reduced but still determined group that waited for the next sign from the sea. The survival of those weeks rested on the same practical habits that had guided the colony from the start. Careful division of whatever could be found, steady watches against the outside, and the quiet acceptance that each day's small gains mattered more than any grand plan. The accounts Percy left behind and the bones later uncovered both served as straightforward reminders of how far the situation had pushed a few individuals. For the rest, the story remained one of shared labour and measured hope, carried forward one search, one catch, and one repaired tool at a time. The starving time had reached its lowest point and now began its slow turn toward whatever might come next along the James River. May arrived with warmer winds moving up the James River, and the ground inside the triangular enclosure had softened enough for the remaining search parties to dig a few more roots each morning. The 60 or so survivors still moved through the same measured routines that had carried them through the winter, though their steps had grown even slower and their voices quieter. Percy kept the council records up to date, noting the slight increase in river catches and the first handful of wild greens that could be added to the common kettles. The palisade stood as it had, its stakes weathered and some leaning where frost had shifted the earth, but the gates remained barred at night, and the guards still took their turns on the parapets. The Powhatan watchers had become less visible in recent weeks, yet the company stayed cautious, never venturing far beyond the cleared ground. The fort had settled into this narrow existence, its people conserving every bit of strength for the next day's small tasks, while the river carried the promise of open water downstream. One clear morning toward the end of the month, the lookouts on the riverside of the palisade called out in voices that carried a note of surprise rather than alarm. 2 small ships had appeared around the bend, their sails catching the light as they moved steadily with the tide. These were not the large supply vessels expected from England, but compact craft built from local cedar and oak, their lines simple and their hulls showing the marks of hurried construction. The Deliverance and the Patience had been pieced together on the beaches of Bermuda after the Sea Venture wreck, using the timbers salvaged from the flagship and whatever the islands provided. On board were Sir Thomas Gates, the designated Lieutenant Governor under the new charter, along with Sir George Somers, Captain Christopher Newport, and roughly 150 men, women, and children who had survived the 9 months on the Bermuda reefs. They had set sail from those islands in early May, carrying what stores they could gather, pigs, turtles, and dried fish, and expecting to find a functioning colony waiting for their arrival. The ships anchored off the landing stage, and the newcomers lowered boats to row ashore. Gates stood in the lead boat, his eyes scanning the low peninsula and the wooden walls that had been described in the company letters back in England. What he saw did not match any of those descriptions. The palisade looked patched and worn, with sections of the earthen bank slumped from winter rains. Smoke rose from only a few chimneys, and the lanes visible through the open gates appeared empty except for a handful of figures moving slowly toward the river gate. The survivors inside had heard the lookout calls and gathered what strength they had to meet the boats. They stepped out onto the bank in their ragged clothing, doublets and jerkins hanging loose on frames that had once filled them properly, faces hollowed by months of short rations, eyes marked by the steady fatigue of survival. Some leaned on makeshift staffs, others walked with the careful shuffle of people who had not eaten a full meal in weeks. Gates stepped onto the landing stage and took in the scene without speaking at first. The men who had sailed with him from Bermuda, hardened by their own ordeal on the reefs but still carrying the colour of better provisions, stood beside him and stared in the same quiet disbelief. Percy came forward to greet the Lieutenant Governor, his own clothing patched and his frame thinned like the rest. He gave a brief report of the winter's events, the loss of nearly 440 people since the August arrivals, and the steady pressure from the Powhatan that had kept the fort isolated. Gates listened, then asked to see the storehouse and the full extent of the company. The group walked through the gates into the enclosure, and the contrast became sharper with every step. Huts that had once housed families stood half empty, their roofs sagging and their walls showing gaps where daub had fallen away. The church building, used for council meetings and shelter, held a few of the weakest survivors resting on the floor. The storehouse, raised on posts to keep out damp and rats, had its doors open to reveal shelves swept nearly clean except for a few scraps of boiled leather and the last bits of fish drying on racks. The condition of the people struck Gates most directly. The survivors who had gathered to meet the boats now stood in the open square, their numbers so reduced that the space felt oversized around them. Gentlemen and labourers alike showed the same marks of hunger. Skin pulled tight over bones, hair unkempt, hands marked by constant digging and mending. The women and the few children present moved among them with the same slow care, carrying water or small loads of firewood because every task still fell to whoever could manage it. Gates had expected to find a colony strengthened by the third supply and already planting fields for the coming season. Instead, he faced a group that had been living on roots, river fish, and whatever else the ground and the palisade edge could provide. One of the Bermuda men later noted, with the dry understatement that sometimes surfaced in these accounts, that the Jamestown Company looked as though they had been practicing a new form of English economy, cutting every expense, including the one for daily meals. Gates took command at once, as the new charter required. He called the council together in the church building and reviewed the company books that Percy had maintained through the winter. The figures confirmed the scale of the loss, from more than 500 in the autumn to barely 60 still alive in late May. The The stores that had arrived with the August ships had been exhausted months earlier, and the foraging that had sustained the survivors had reached its limit. Gates ordered an immediate count of all able bodies and directed the Bermuda party to unload what provisions they had brought: salted turtle meat, pork from the island pigs, and barrels of fresh water. These supplies were distributed at once under council supervision, giving the survivors their first full portions in weeks. The women set extra kettles over the fires, and the smell of actual meat boiling spread through the lanes for the first time since autumn. The lieutenant governor walked the full circuit of the fort with Percy and Summers, noting the state of the defences and the buildings. The palisade needed new stakes in several places, and the river gate showed signs of rot where the water had lapped against it through the winter. The gardens beyond the walls had gone untended for months, their fences broken and the ground covered with weeds. Fishing continued from the shallop, now joined by the boats from the new ships, and the combined crews brought in larger catches that afternoon. Gates assigned the Bermuda arrivals to work details immediately: carpenters to repair roofs, labourers to clear the lanes, and guards to take over the parapet so the original survivors could rest. The newcomers moved with the energy of people who had endured a shipwreck but had eaten regularly on the islands, while the Jamestown group worked at a slower pace, their strength returning only gradually with the added food. Inside the huts, the change in routine began to register. Men who had spent the winter searching for roots now sat for a time near the fires, their bodies adjusting to the unfamiliar feeling of a meal that filled the stomach. The women mended clothing with fresh thread from the Bermuda stores, and children carried water with steps that no longer dragged quite so heavily. Gates met with the full company in the square before evening, reading the relevant sections of the new charter aloud and explaining that the Virginia Company expected the colony to be placed on firmer footing under his direction. He made no grand promises about quick recovery. He simply stated that the immediate task was to stabilize the fort, bury the dead properly, and prepare for whatever might come next. The survivors listened without cheers or complaints, their quiet acceptance reflecting the months they had already passed through. The ships remained anchored at the landing stage through the day, their decks still holding tools and canvas that could be used for repairs. Newport and Summers oversaw the unloading while Gates continued his assessment inside the walls. The lieutenant governor spoke with the surgeon about the fevers and dysentery that still lingered among the weakest, and he ordered the sick moved to the better sheltered huts with extra blankets from the Bermuda cargo. The council records were updated with the new arrivals, bringing the total company back above 200 for the first time since the previous autumn. Yet even with the added numbers, the fort felt sparse. The lanes that had once been crowded now showed open space between the remaining structures, and the storehouse, though restocked with island provisions, would not last indefinitely without fresh planting or further supply. As evening approached, the guards lit lanterns along the parapets, and the gates were secured for the night. Fires burned brighter in the huts than they had in months, and the sound of quiet conversation returned to the shelter's practical talk of the next day's work and the river's condition. Gates retired to the council quarters with Percy to review maps and plan the immediate steps for rebuilding. The lieutenant governor had crossed the Atlantic expecting to govern a growing settlement. Instead, he had stepped into a scene that required every practical skill he possessed just to keep the remaining people alive and the walls standing. The river flowed past the anchored ships under the spring sky, carrying the warmer air downstream, while inside the triangular enclosure, the company settled into a new rhythm shaped by the arrival of the two small cedar vessels and the steady hand of the man the company had sent to lead them. The survivors who had endured the starving time now shared their spaces with the Bermuda party, exchanging quiet accounts of the winter and the island ordeal. The contrast between the two groups remained visible in their frames and their movements, yet the shared task of repair and rationing began to blend them into one company under Gates's direction. The fort had not been abandoned or overrun. It had simply been reduced to its narrowest margin and was now receiving the first real assistance since the previous summer. The lieutenant governor's arrival marked the quiet turning of a long season, bringing fresh stores, fresh labour, and a new authority that could begin to address the damage left by the months of isolation and shortage. The palisade still enclosed the same low peninsula, but the people within its walls had, for the first time in half a year, a reason to look toward the next weeks with something steadier than bare endurance: the decision to abandon. The days following Sir Thomas Gates's arrival passed in a steady round of assessment and small repairs. The Lieutenant Governor walked the lanes each morning with Percy and the council, noting the exact state of every structure and the condition of the remaining company. Carpenters from the Bermuda party set to work, replacing rotten stakes in the palisade and patching roofs with fresh thatch cut from the riverbank. The women sorted the new stores brought ashore from the Deliverance and the Patience, measuring out the salted turtle meat and pork so that the combined group of roughly 200 could eat 2 modest meals each day. Fishing crews went out in larger numbers, returning with enough perch and catfish to add to the kettles without emptying the island provisions too quickly. Children carried water and kindling with steps that had regained a little steadiness, while the guards on the parapets kept their eyes on the tree line where the Powhatan presence had grown quieter but had not disappeared entirely. Gates reviewed the company books in detail and listened to accounts from both the original survivors and the Bermuda arrivals. The numbers told a clear story. The stores from the August fleet had run out months earlier, the winter foraging had reached its limit, and the fort's fields lay untended and overgrown. Even with the fresh supplies from Bermuda, the total would last only a few weeks at the current rate of consumption. Planting a new crop would take time, and the soil around the enclosure had been worked hard without proper rotation. The Powhatan continued to restrict movement beyond the cleared ground, making it risky to clear and plant larger fields farther out. Gates called the full council together in the church building and laid out the situation without softening the facts. The colony had been reduced to a handful of weakened people holding a damaged fort, and the resources on hand could not support a full recovery before the next winter returned. The decision took shape over several council meetings. Gates weighed the new charter's instructions to establish a permanent settlement against the practical reality he saw each day in the hollow faces and patched walls. He consulted with Summers and Newport, both of whom had seen the fort in better times and now recognized how far it had declined. The group considered waiting for the main supply fleet under Lord de la Warr, but no one could be certain when those ships would arrive or whether they would carry enough to rebuild from such a low point. The river remained open, the ships at the landing stage were sound, and the company still had enough able bodies to man the sails and handle the shallop. After careful discussion, the council reached a unanimous conclusion. The fort should be abandoned, the structures burned to prevent their use by any hostile force, and the entire company evacuated down the James River to the Chesapeake Bay, where they could wait for rescue or sail for England if no help appeared. The order went out on the morning of the 7th of June, 1610. Gates addressed the assembled company in the open square, explaining the plan in plain terms. The survivors listened without protest. Many had already accepted that the triangular enclosure had become more prison than home after the long winter. Work details formed at once under the Lieutenant Governor's direction. Men began loading the remaining tools, canvas and personal belongings into the ships and the shallop. The women packed the last stores of food and folded the few usable blankets. Children carried smaller items to the landing stage, their hands moving with the same quiet efficiency they had learned during the months of searching for roots. The carpenters dismantled what could be salvaged from the church and storehouse pegs, planks, and iron fittings, while other teams stacked firewood against the inner walls in preparation for the final act. The evacuation proceeded methodically through the day. The Deliverance and the Patience were loaded first, their decks growing crowded with barrels, tools and people. The shallop made repeated trips between the landing stage and the larger ships, ferrying those who could not climb the sides easily. Percy supervised the removal of the council records and the few maps that Smith had drawn in earlier years, ensuring that nothing of value to the company would be left behind. The livestock that had survived the winter, only a handful of pigs were slaughtered, and their meat added to the ship stores. As the afternoon light lengthened, the lanes inside the fort emptied. Huts that had sheltered families through the starving time stood silent, their doors left open and their fires cold for the first time in months. Before the final departure, Gates ordered the structures set alight. Small teams moved through the enclosure with torches, touching flame to the stacked firewood and the thatch roofs. Smoke rose first from the storehouse, then from the church and the rows of huts. The palisade itself was left standing, but the interior burned steadily as the company watched from the ships. The flames climbed the wooden frames and sent sparks drifting over the river, a bright column against the evening sky that could be seen for miles. The Powhatan watchers at the tree line would have seen it too, though no one inside the boats could know what they made of the sight. The triangular fort that had been built with such effort in 1607 and defended through 2 hard winters was now reduced to smouldering timbers and ash. The ships weighed anchor as darkness fell and began the slow journey down the James River with the outgoing tide. The Deliverance led, followed by the Patience and the Shallop. On deck, the company sat or stood in quiet groups, their eyes turned back toward the glow that marked the place they had called Jamestown. The survivors of the Starving Time shared space with the Bermuda party, the 2 groups now fully blended by the shared decision to leave. Conversation stayed low, and practical comments on the river's depth, the handling of the sails, and the stores that would need to be rationed carefully until they reached the bay. Gates moved among them, speaking with individuals and making certain that the sick received extra portions from the island provisions. The night passed with lanterns lit at the mastheads and guards posted to watch for any movement along the banks. The river carried the small fleet steadily toward the Chesapeake. The low banks slipped past in the darkness, their trees and marshes familiar to those who had explored them in better days. By morning the ships had covered a good distance, and the company could no longer see the smoke from the burned fort. The wind freshened from the south, filling the sails and pushing the vessels faster through the water. Fishing lines went over the sides when the ships slowed, adding to the stores. The women prepared simple meals in the ship's galleys, boiling the last of the turtle meat with whatever fish had been caught. Children found spaces on deck to rest, their small bodies no longer needing to carry water or kindling for the fort's fires. The entire company moved with the gentle roll of the hulls, a rhythm different from the steady tread of the palisade lanes. Gates kept the ships close together and maintained regular watches. He reviewed the charts that had survived and plotted their course toward the bay where they could anchor safely and wait for the expected supply fleet. The decision to abandon had been reached without drama or dissent. It had grown naturally from the plain facts of stores, health, and the risk of another winter inside the damaged walls. The river widened as they approached the mouth, its waters turning brackish and then salty. The survivors who had endured the starving time looked out at the open horizon with the quiet understanding that they had left behind the place that had nearly claimed them all. The fort's ashes remained upstream, a dark patch on the peninsula that would cool and disappear under new growth in the coming weeks. By the second day, the small fleet reached the broader waters near the Chesapeake entrance. The ships anchored in a sheltered cove to rest the company and take stock of provisions. Gates called another council meeting aboard the Deliverance, confirming that the evacuation had been completed without loss, and that the stores, though limited, could sustain the group for several more weeks if carefully managed. The men repaired minor damage to the rigging, and the women aired the blankets on deck. The river had carried them away from the triangular enclosure and its long winter, and now the bay opened before them with its wider sky and steadier winds. The company settled into shipboard routines, the same practical habits of rationing and watchkeeping that had kept them alive inside the fort now serving them on the water. The decision to abandon Jamestown had been the logical outcome of the starving time and the delayed relief. Gates had weighed the charter's hopes against the visible condition of the survivors and the empty storehouse, and the council had agreed that departure offered the best chance of preserving the remaining lives. The burning of the fort ensured that nothing of value would fall into other hands, and the river had provided a clear path to safety. As the ships rocked gently at anchor in the cove, the company looked toward the horizon where help might still appear. The low peninsula and its smouldering ruins lay behind them, a chapter closed by necessity rather than defeat. The James River had witnessed the building, the hardship, and now the quiet withdrawal, carrying the small fleet toward whatever the next tide would bring. The Lord de la Warr rescue. The small fleet lay at anchor in the sheltered cove near the mouth of the James River for 2 full days, while the company rested and the tour of the next cove. Council reviewed the remaining stores once more. The Deliverance and the Patience rocked gently on the tidal swell, their decks crowded but orderly. Gates kept the watches regular and the rations measured with the same care Percy had used inside the fort. Fishing lines went over the sides each morning, adding modest catches of fish to the island provisions of salted turtle and pork. The survivors moved about the ships with slow, deliberate steps, their bodies still adjusting to the fuller meals and the different motion of the water. Children found places to sit in the sun, and the women aired blankets and mended what clothing could be saved. The river had carried them safely downstream, and now the broader waters of the Chesapeake stretched ahead, offering a wider view of the sky and a steadier breeze. On the morning of June 10, lookouts on the Deliverance called out when sails appeared on the northern horizon. 3 larger ships were approaching under full canvas, moving with purpose toward the bay entrance. These were the vessels of the new supply fleet commanded by Lord Thomas West, Baron de la Warr, who had been appointed governor for life under the reorganized Virginia Company Charter. The ships, the De la Warr, the Blessing and the Hercules, had left England in April carrying fresh supplies, livestock, and more than 150 new settlers. Lord de la Warr stood on the deck of his flagship, expecting to find an established colony at Jamestown. Instead, as the vessels drew closer, the crews on both sides recognized one another, and signals passed between the ships. The 2 fleets met in the open water of the bay. Boats were lowered, and Gates, Somers, and Percy rowed across to the De la Warr to report directly to the new governor. Lord de la Warr listened as Gates described the condition of the colony when he had arrived in late May, the reduced numbers, the burned fort, and the decision to evacuate. The governor's face remained composed, but the details clearly surprised him. He had sailed with instructions to strengthen and expand the settlement, bringing carpenters, farmers, and ample stores of meal, tools, and seed. The news that the entire company had abandoned the site and burned the structures changed the immediate plan. After a short discussion on the flagship, de la Warr gave the order for the combined fleet to turn back up the James River and reoccupy the peninsula. The evacuation had lasted less than 3 days. The rescue had arrived just in time to reverse it. The ships weighed anchor and began the journey upstream with the incoming tide. The larger vessels from England took the lead, their deeper drafts requiring careful navigation of the river channels that Smith had mapped years earlier. The Deliverance and the Patience followed, their smaller size making the return easier. On every deck the mood shifted from quiet resignation to renewed purpose. The survivors of the Starving Time stood at the rails and watched the familiar banks slide past in reverse. The low peninsula came into view again by late afternoon, its triangular outline still visible, though the interior lay in ashes. Smoke had long since died away, leaving charred timbers and collapsed roofs scattered across the enclosure. The palisade stakes remained standing in many places, their tops blackened but the line of defence still recognisable. The combined company, now numbering more than 300, went ashore at once. Lord de la Warr stepped onto the landing stage first, surveying the ruined site with a practical eye. He ordered the new settlers and the able-bodied from both groups to begin clearing the debris immediately. Men pulled down the remaining burned frames and dragged the charred wood aside to make space for fresh construction. Carpenters from the supply fleet began framing new storehouses using timber cut from the nearby woods, while labourers cleared the ground for gardens and reinforced the sections of the palisade that had survived. The women and children helped sort the supplies brought from the English ships, barrels of meal, casks of salted beef, tools and seed for English wheat and native corn. Livestock cattle, goats and more pigs were driven ashore and turned loose in the cleared areas under guard. Gates and Percy worked alongside de la Warr to organise the labour. The Lieutenant Governor shared what he had learned from the winter, pointing out the best locations for the new wells and the places where the ground drained poorly. Percy updated the council records with the arrival of the new governor and the fresh stores, noting the exact numbers of people and the quantities unloaded. The combined workforce made rapid progress through the afternoon and into the following days. New huts rose on the old lanes, their frames joined with fresh pegs and roofs covered with split shingles brought from the ships. The storehouse took shape first, raised on posts as before but built larger to hold the English supplies and protect them from damp and rats. A new church building was framed on the site of the old one, its simple altar placed where services had once been held. Lord de la Warr enforced a stricter discipline from the start. He divided the company into organised teams with clear daily assignments, much as Smith had done in earlier years, but with the added authority of his commission from the king and the company. Idleness was not tolerated. Every able man worked or stood guard. Rations were distributed fairly, but with the understanding that labour earned the full share. The new settlers, fresh from England, learned quickly under the direction of the veterans who had survived the starving time. The contrast between the two groups remained visible at first. The newcomers still carried the weight of the long voyage, but had not yet faced the long winter. Yet the shared tasks of clearing and building began to blend them into one company. Inside the rebuilt enclosure, the daily rhythm returned with new energy. Fishing crews went out each morning in the shallop and the ship's boats, bringing back larger catches now that more hands could clean and salt the fish. Gardens were laid out beyond the repaired palisade, with rows of English peas planted between hills of native corn following the pattern the Powhatan had long used. The women managed the cooking fires and the sorting of supplies, while children carried water and gathered kindling from the cleared ground. Guards walked the parapets in regular shifts, their muskets loaded with fresh powder from the English ships. The Powhatan watchers appeared again at the tree line, but the increased numbers and the visible activity inside the fort seemed to keep them at a greater distance for the time being. De la Warr made his headquarters in one of the newly framed buildings and called regular council meetings to plan the next steps. He intended to expand the settlement, send exploring parties upriver when safe, and establish firmer trade relations once the immediate rebuilding was complete. The governor also saw to the proper burial of those who had died during the starving time, ordering simple markers placed where the graves could be identified. The ashes of the old fort were cleared away, and the ground levelled so that new structures could stand on firmer foundations. Each day's work added visible progress. The palisade grew stronger, the storehouse filled with barrels, and the lanes between the houses became orderly once more. The rescue had come at the narrowest margin. Had the supply fleet arrived only a week or two later, the small evacuation fleet might have sailed out of the bay and headed for England, leaving the peninsula empty. Instead, the timely meeting in the Chesapeake had turned the withdrawal into a brief pause. The combined company now numbered enough to defend the site and begin the slow work of recovery. The river flowed past the landing stage as it always had, but now it carried the larger ships and the fresh supplies that gave the colony a second chance. The survivors of the starving time moved among the new arrivals with the quiet knowledge that they had held on just long enough for help to reach them. Lord de la Warr's arrival and the decision to return upriver marked the end of the most desperate chapter. The fort rose again on the same low ground, its walls repaired and its buildings renewed with English timber and English resolve. The company settled into the renewed routines of labour, guard duty, and measured rations, this time with fuller stores and clearer leadership. The James River had witnessed the building, the hardship, the burning, and now the rebuilding, all within a few short days. The triangular enclosure stood once more, no longer a place of bare survival, but a foothold that the new governor intended to strengthen and hold. Recovery. A new beginnings. Lord de la Warr wasted no time setting the rebuilt fort on a firmer footing once the company had returned to the low peninsula. He divided the more than 300 people into clear work teams each morning after the first full meal from the new stores. Carpenters framed additional houses along the lanes using fresh timber cut from the woods just beyond the repaired palisade. Labourers cleared the last of the charred debris and levelled the ground for larger gardens. The women sorted the barrels of meal and seed brought from England, while children carried water and stacked firewood in neat piles near the huts. Guards walked the parapets in steady shifts with fresh powder and shot, their presence enough to keep the Powhatan watchers at a respectful distance for the time being. The governor inspected the progress every afternoon, noting each completed section of wall and each new roof in the council book. The stricter rule Warr introduced differed from the earlier attempts at order. He required every able man to complete a full day's assigned task before receiving his full ration, and he posted the daily work list at the storehouse door so no one could claim confusion. Idleness brought a reduction in shares, applied evenly whether the man held the title of gentleman or had arrived as a labourer. The council met each evening to review the tallies, and Warr made certain the records showed exactly how much grain had been planted and how many tools remained in working order. This system stretched the English supplies further while the first crops took root. The settlers who had survived the starving time adjusted to the new pace without complaint. They had already learned how thin the margin between enough and not enough could become. The newcomers from the supply fleet fell into the routine after the first week, their initial stiffness from the long voyage giving way to the steady rhythm of axe and spade. By midsummer, the fort had taken on a more solid appearance than it had shown in the months before the evacuation. The palisade stood straight, with new stakes driven deep, and the earthen bank packed firm against the riverside. Storehouses rose with raised floors to keep the meal dry, and the church building gained a simple bell frame that rang for morning assembly. Gardens extended beyond the walls in orderly rows, with English wheat and peas planted alongside the native corn that the Powhatan had long grown in small hills. Fishing crews brought in steady catches from the James River, and the women salted and smoked the surplus in the new sheds built for that purpose. The livestock, cattle and goats from the English ships grazed in the cleared ground under constant watch, providing milk and occasional meat without the desperate slaughter of the previous winter. The lanes between the houses stayed clear of debris, and the entire enclosure felt less like a camp and more like a working settlement once again. Warr's own health began to fail by late summer, the fevers and dysentery that had weakened so many others taking their turn with him. He remained in command long enough to see the first harvest gathered and stored, then sailed for England in the autumn to recover and report directly to the company. In his place he left Sir Thomas Dale, a veteran soldier who arrived with additional ships in May 1611 carrying more settlers and stricter instructions from London. Dale took the same practical approach but tightened the rules further. He published a set of laws that listed exact penalties for theft of food, neglect of work, or leaving the fort without permission. The company accepted the code because the memory of the starving time remained fresh. No one wanted to risk another season of empty kettles. Dale organised larger work gangs to clear more land upstream and built a small outpost called Henricus farther up the river as a second point of settlement. The fort at Jamestown continued to serve as the main storehouse and landing stage, its population now growing with each new arrival. More ships reached the James River through 1611 and 1612, bringing fresh groups of settlers who stepped ashore with the same mix of hope and uncertainty that had marked the earlier voyages. These newcomers included farmers who knew how to lay out fields properly, blacksmiths who could keep tools sharp, and women whose presence helped balance the company and allowed for families to form. The total numbers climbed past 500 again, though Dale made certain the stores were managed with the same care Warr had established. The extra hands allowed the gardens to expand and the palisade to be extended in places where the original triangle had felt too confining. The river carried the ships upstream with the tide, and the landing stage grew busy with unloading barrels and livestock. The settlers who had lived through the winter of 1609, 1610, watched the new faces with quiet recognition. They knew exactly how quickly supplies could vanish if the work slowed. One of the arrivals in 1610, a man named John Rolfe, had brought with him a practical idea that would quietly change the colony's future. Rolfe had survived the sea venture wreck on Bermuda and reached Jamestown with Gates's party. He carried seeds of a milder strain of tobacco he had obtained in the Caribbean. different from the harsh native variety the Powhatan grew for their own ceremonies. Rolfe planted small experimental plots in the cleared ground outside the fort during the first recovery season. The plants took root in the Virginia soil, their broad leaves growing thick under the summer sun. He tended them carefully, curing the harvested leaves in sheds built for the purpose, and packing them into barrels for the return ships. The first small shipments reached England in 1612 and found ready buyers among merchants and gentlemen who preferred the sweeter taste to the stronger Spanish varieties. The company in London took note at once. Here was a commodity that could pay for the entire venture without relying on gold or minerals that had never appeared in useful quantities. Dale encouraged the shift toward tobacco once the basic food crops had been secured. He allotted small plots to individual settlers who agreed to plant a portion in the new crop while still maintaining their share of corn and peas for the common stores. Rolfe's method spread quickly because it required no special tools beyond a hoe and a curing shed. By 1613, the fields around the fort and the new outpost at Henricus showed rows of tobacco plants standing taller than the surrounding corn in places. The leaves were harvested in late summer, hung to dry, and packed for shipment. The returning ships carried the barrels as their main cargo, and the proceeds helped fund more supplies and settlers for the next voyage. The colony had found a steady source of income that grew from the same soil that had nearly starved it only a few years earlier. It was almost as if the land had been waiting for the right plant to turn hardship into a modest profit, though no one at the time would have described the change in quite such neat terms. The daily routines inside the fort adjusted to the new crop without losing their steady focus on survival. Men worked the tobacco fields in the mornings and returned to the common tasks of repairing tools or standing guard in the afternoons. Women helped with the curing sheds, turning the leaves and checking that the drying proceeded evenly. Children carried water to the young plants and learned to spot the first signs of blight that could ruin a row. The storehouse continued to hold the English meal and salted meat as a reserve, but the tobacco barrels stacked alongside them represented the first real return the company had seen on its investment. Dale kept the work lists posted and the rations fair, making certain that the food crops were never neglected for the sake of the new cash plant. The Powhatan watched the expansion from the tree line, their own fields still producing corn and beans, yet they maintained a cautious distance as the English numbers grew and the palisade extended. By 1614, the colony had passed its 7th year on the James River. The triangular fort had grown into a more substantial settlement with outlying farms and the second outpost upstream. Ships arrived and departed with greater regularity, bringing tools and cloth while carrying away the cured tobacco leaves that now filled their holds. The survivors of the starving time formed a smaller but steadier core within the larger company, their experience helping the newcomers avoid the mistakes of the early seasons. Rolfe's tobacco had become the practical foundation for the future, its leaves providing the revenue that paid for supplies and encouraged more families to cross the ocean. The river flowed past the landing stage under the summer sun, carrying the loaded ships downstream toward the Chesapeake and the open sea. While inside the walls, the work continued at the same measured pace that had brought the settlement through its narrowest hour and into a time when it could begin to stand on its own. The recovery had been slow and deliberate, built on the stricter rules Warr and Dale had enforced, and on the steady arrival of new ships and new hands. The shift toward tobacco had not come as a sudden discovery, but as the quiet result of one man's careful planting and the company's willingness to test a crop that could travel well across the Atlantic. The fort stood solid once more, its palisade enclosing houses, storehouses, and gardens that showed the results of consistent labour. The people moved through their days with the practical knowledge that survival still required daily effort, but that the land could now offer something beyond bare endurance. The James River continued its steady course, linking the settlement to the wider world and carrying the first fruits of that new beginning toward the markets of England. Legacy of the Starving Time. The years after 1614 saw the colony settle into a steadier pattern built, directly on the lessons of the winter of 1609 and 1610. Dale continued to enforce the work rules and the laws he had published, making certain that food crops always came first, even as tobacco fields spread across the cleared ground. Ships arrived each spring and summer with new settlers and supplies, and the return voyages carried barrels of cured leaves that brought steady revenue to the Virginia Company in London. The triangular fort at Jamestown grew into the central hub of a network that now included outposts like Henricus farther upstream, each one laid out with stronger palisades and larger storehouses than the original structures. The population climbed past 1,000 by the middle of the decade, and the lanes inside the walls filled with the regular sounds of hammering, planting, and the low talk of people who knew exactly how quickly a season could turn against them. The memory of the starving time remained part of the daily accounting. No one allowed the storehouse to run low again, without immediate steps to replenish it from the fields or the river. That winter had shown the company in England that the earlier charters had been too optimistic about quick riches and easy self-sufficiency. The reports Percy sent back, along with the accounts from Gates and De La Warr, led to a full review of the venture's management. The Virginia Company restructured its operations, tightening oversight from London and sending governors with clearer authority to enforce labour and order. The experience also made future leaders more realistic about the supplies needed for each new group of settlers. Ships began to carry extra barrels of meal and seed as standard practice, and the instructions given to captains emphasized the importance of arriving before winter rather than risking the scattering that had left Jamestown without the Sea Venture's cargo. These changes did not erase the hardship of the early years, but they reduced the chance that another season of isolation and short rations would reduce the colony to the same narrow margin. The events of 1609 and 1610 also shaped the way the English approached relations with the Powhatan people. The strategic blockade Chief Powhatan had maintained during the winter taught both sides that trade could not be taken for granted, and that each group had limits on what it could share. Later, governors worked to establish more formal agreements, including the marriage of John Rolfe to Pocahontas in 1614, which brought a period of calmer exchange and allowed corn and other native crops to flow more reliably into the English stores. The Powhatan continued to watch the expansion of tobacco fields with caution, yet the increased numbers inside the fort and the stronger defences made open conflict less frequent for a time. The starving time had revealed that neither side could simply push the other aside without cost, and that practical dealings, however cautious, offered the best path for both to occupy the same stretch of the James River. The human cost of that winter stayed visible in the records and in the smaller company that had held the fort until Gates arrived. Of the roughly 500 people present in the autumn of 1609, only about 60 remained alive by the following May. The graves outside the palisade marked the steady toll of hunger, illness, and exposure, and the council books listed each loss by name where it was known. Those who survived carried the experience forward in the way they managed rations, the way they repaired tools before they broke, and the way they kept the gardens tended even when tobacco promised quicker returns. The women who had managed the kettles and mended clothing through the coldest months taught the new arrivals how to stretch every scrap and how to recognize the first signs of shortage before it became critical. Children born after the starving time grew up hearing the quiet accounts of those months, learning early that the land required constant effort and that the river could not always be counted on to provide. The legacy reached beyond the James River to influence later English efforts along the Atlantic coast. When the Pilgrims arrived at Plymouth in 1620, they carried detailed reports of Jamestown's early struggles and made certain to plant crops immediately and to store supplies with greater care. The Virginia Company's experience with the starving time helped shape the instructions given to other colonial ventures, emphasizing the need for skilled farmers, clear leadership, and realistic expectations about the first years. The shift to tobacco as the economic foundation spread to other settlements, providing a model for how a cash crop could sustain a colony when mineral wealth proved elusive. Jamestown itself remained the oldest continuous English settlement in North America, its survival after 1610, proving that a foothold could be maintained even after near collapse. The winter also highlighted practical truths about early colonial life that later generations studied in the company records and the archaeological layers at the site. It showed that social classes from England did not always determine who endured best. Gentlemen and labourers had faced the same empty kettles and had worked side by side when roots and fish became the only food available. The event made clear that leadership mattered more than titles, that strict but fair rules on labour could stretch limited stores, and that dependence on outside trade carried risks when relations with local people changed. The cut marks on the bones later uncovered at the site, including those of the young girl known as Jane, stood as a direct reminder of how far desperation could push a small number of individuals when every other option had been exhausted. The records and the physical evidence together gave a straightforward picture of a community tested to its limit, and of the ordinary decisions people made to see one more day. By the 1620s, the colony had grown stable enough for the Virginia Company to grant land to individual settlers, moving away from the earlier system of common stores. Tobacco fields stretched along the river banks, and ships arrived and departed on regular schedules. The fort at Jamestown served as the seat of the first elected assembly in 1619, where representatives from the various settlements met to discuss local laws and the needs of the company. The starving time was by then more than a decade in the past, yet its influence remained in the careful management of supplies and the steady pace of work that kept the storehouses filled. The river continued to carry the loaded ships downstream each autumn, their holds filled with the leaves that had become the colony's main export and the foundation of its long-term survival. The events of 1609 and 1610 had nearly ended the English presence on the James River, but the narrow escape and the lessons it provided helped secure the foothold that grew into a larger colonial enterprise. The winter had tested every assumption the first settlers brought from England and had replaced them with the practical knowledge that survival required steady labour, clear rules, and a realistic view of the land and its people. The company that had once numbered in the hundreds and been reduced to a handful had held on just long enough for the supply fleet to arrive and reverse the decision to abandon the site. That decision, reached in the ashes of the burned fort and overturned within days by Lord Delawar's timely ships, became the turning point that allowed the settlement to move forward. The triangular enclosure rose again, stronger and more organised, and the colony settled into the routines that carried it through the following decades. The legacy of the starving time lay in the quieter, steadier habits that replaced the earlier hopes of quick wealth. It lay in the expanded gardens, the repaired palisades, the careful records of stores, and the recognition that the land required patient work rather than grand plans. It lay in the way later governors and settlers spoke of the winter when they prepared for new arrivals, reminding them that the James River could be generous in season, but unforgiving when trade failed and ships were delayed. The colony had learned that endurance came from shared effort and practical adjustments, not from the promises printed in company charters. The river flowed past the landing stage as it had since 1607, carrying the tobacco ships toward the Chesapeake and the open sea, while inside the walls the company continued the daily tasks that kept the settlement alive and growing. The starving time had revealed the limits of the early venture and, in doing so, had helped shape the patterns that allowed English America to take root and endure. You can let your breathing slow now, matching the gentle rhythm of the water against the bank. The lanterns along the lanes have been dimmed, and the guards walk their rounds with quiet steps. Nothing more needs doing tonight. The colony that nearly slipped away had held on, and the land around it continued its slow, ordinary cycle of seasons. Rest easy, knowing the story has reached its calm close. The river will keep its course, the fields will green again in the morning, and the people inside the walls will rise to another practical day. Let your thoughts drift with the current, simple and untroubled. The hardship had its time, the recovery followed, and the settlement moved forward in the same measured way it had learned to survive.